The Coming of the Martians. Chapter 1. The Eve of the War. No one would have believed that late in the 19th century, this world was being watched closely by intelligences greater than man. Yet, they were as human as us. As men went about their daily activities, they were carefully watched and studied. Totally satisfied, men were quite sure that no other planets had life on them, or could ever threaten humans. In those days, people thought that even if there were men on Mars, they would be less developed than human beings. Yet across the gap of space, cold and unfriendly minds considered to be no more advanced than farm animals regarded this planet with jealous eyes and slowly and surely made their plans against us. The planet Mars turns about the Sun at an average distance of 140 million miles, and the light and heat it receives from the Sun is scarcely half of that received by Earth. It has been suggested that it is older than our world, and that life on Mars must have begun even before Earth had ceased to be anything more than hot liquid. The fact that it is 7 times smaller than Earth must have hurried its cooling to the temperature at which life could begin. It has air and water and all that is necessary to support life. The cooling of Mars is extensive. Its physical state is still a mystery, but we know now that even in its hottest region, the midday temperature is not as warm as Earth's coldest winter. Its air is much thinner than ours, and its oceans now only cover a third of its surface. As its slow seasons change, huge ice blocks melt and repeatedly flood the warmer zones. The cold climate and floods present a daily problem for the people of Mars. Their immediate needs have made them resourceful and determined. Looking across only 35 million miles of space, they see our warm Earth with its damp green forests and dark blue oceans as a place of hope. Man already admits that life is a constant struggle for existence, and it would seem that this is also the belief of the Martians. In contrast to the life on Earth, their world has become very cold, and to attack us is their only escape from the destruction that approaches them. Before we judge them too severely, we must remember what damage man has caused, not only to our animals, but to the races of people we have regarded as being less important than ourselves. Can we really blame the Martians for doing the same thing? The Martians seem to have calculated their approach with amazing accuracy. Had our instruments been suitable, we might have seen the coming trouble early in the 19th century. Scientists watched the red planet, but failed to understand what they were seeing and recording. All that time, the Martians must have been getting ready. During the attack of 1894, a great light was seen on the visible part of the Martian disk. I think that this glow may have been the formation of the huge gun from which their shots were fired at us, because unusual markings were seen near the site during the next 2 attacks. The trouble burst on us 6 years ago now. As Mars approached the attack, great excitement was caused with the sighting of a huge volume of glowing gas on the planet. It had occurred before midnight of the 12th, and the instrument in use showed a mass of flaming gas moving quickly toward Earth. This jet of fire had become invisible shortly after 12. Yet only a little note appeared in the newspaper the next day. The world knew nothing about one of the most serious dangers that ever threatened the human race. Had I not met Ogilvy, the scientist, I would not have known anything myself. He was very excited and invited me to keep watch with him that night. I still remember that watch very clearly. The black and silent room, the lamp throwing a pale glow on the floor in the corner, and the sound of the clock on the wall. Looking into the night sky, we saw the small, not quite round planet swimming in a circle of deep blue. It seemed so tiny and still, like a faintly marked dot of silver stripes. Mars was more than 40 million miles away, but few people realize the size of the huge empty space in which our planets live. Flying quickly and invisibly toward me, across that remarkable distance, came the object. It was that deadly missile that was to bring so much trouble and death to Earth. That night there was another rush of gas from the distant planet. Just before midnight, I saw a red flash at the edge of the outline. Ogilvy and I changed places, and he gasped at the column of gas that shot toward us. The same night, another invisible missile started on its way to Earth from Mars. I did not suspect the meaning of the minute glow I had seen and what it would mean to me later. Down below in the darkness were hundreds of innocent people sleeping in peace. Ogilvy laughed at the idea of Mars having people who were signaling us. He thought that heavy showers of meteorites might be falling on the planet, or that a huge explosion was in progress. He pointed out to me how unlikely it was that Earth and Mars had formed in the same way as each other. "The chances that there are men on Mars are 1,000,000 to 1, he said. Hundreds of people saw the flame that night, and for the following 10 nights. No one could explain why the flame ceased after the 10th night. Thick clouds of smoke were visible as they spread through the planet's clear atmosphere and covered the more familiar features. At last, even the daily papers wrote about explosions on Mars. All through this, the missiles the Martians had fired at us rushed through space toward Earth. Now it seems amazing to me that people live their daily lives without fear, despite the terrible danger hanging over us. Then came the night of the first falling star. It was seen early in the morning as a flame, about 90 miles high in the atmosphere. Denning, our greatest authority on meteorites, thought it fell to the ground about 100 miles to the east. I was at home and saw nothing of this strangest of all objects that came to Earth from outer space. Some say it traveled with a hissing sound. Many people must have seen it fall and thought it was another meteorite. But no one seems to have looked for the fallen mass that night. The next morning, Ogilvy, who had seen the shooting star, thought a meteorite had landed somewhere on the common near Horsell. The object itself lay almost entirely buried in sand and looked like a huge cylinder coated with gray scales. Ogilvy approached the mass, surprised at the size and shape, since most meteorites are almost round. It was still too hot to touch from its flight through space. From inside the cylinder, he heard a noise that he thought was due to the cooling of its surface, but he did not consider then that the object might be hollow. He stood at the edge of the pit, staring at the cylinder's unusual shape and color, and wondering why it had arrived at this time. The only sounds were faint movements from inside the cylinder. Suddenly, he noticed that some of the gray ash that covered the meteorite was falling off the circular edge of the end. It was dropping off in sheets and falling down on the sand. A large piece dropped off and fell with a sharp noise that terrified him. For a minute, he scarcely realized what this meant and climbed down into the pit to see the cylinder more clearly. Even then, he thought that the cooling of the body of the mass might account for the falling ash. But why was the ash only falling from the end of the cylinder? Then he noticed that the circular top of the cylinder was turning slowly on its body. It was such a gradual movement that he discovered it only through observing that a black mark that had been near him was now at the other side of the circle. Then he saw the mark move forward an inch or two. At once, he realized that the cylinder was hollow, with an end that screwed out. Something inside the cylinder was turning the top. Chapter 2. The cylinder opens. "Good heavens," said Ogilvy. "There's a man in it, half burned to death. He's trying to escape." Immediately he linked the object with the flash on Mars. The thought of the trapped creature was so disturbing that he forgot the heat and went to help turn the cylinder. Luckily, the dull glow stopped him before he could burn his hands on the hot metal. Hesitating, he climbed out of the pit and set off running quickly into Woking. He met a farmer and tried to make him understand, but Ogilvy's story and appearance were so wild that the man simply drove on. He was equally unsuccessful with the owner of the hotel, who thought he was mad and tried to lock him behind the bar. That attempt calmed Ogilvy, and he was relieved when he saw Henderson, the London journalist. "Henderson, you saw that shooting star last night?" "Well," said Henderson, "it's out on Horsell Common now." "Wonderful," said Henderson, "a fallen meteorite." "But it's something more than a meteorite. It's an artificial cylinder, man, with something inside." "What's that?" shouted Henderson. As the two men hurried back to the common, Ogilvy told him all that he had seen. They found the cylinder still lying in the same position, but now the sounds inside had stopped. A thin circle of bright metal showed between the top and the body of the cylinder, where air was either entering or escaping at the edge, with a thin hissing sound. They listened, knocked on the metal with a stick, and not getting any response, decided the men inside must either be unconscious or dead. The two, realizing they were quite unable to assist anyone, went back to the town to get help. Henderson immediately went into the railway station to send further news to London, as earlier newspaper articles had already introduced the idea of Martians to the general public. By 8 o'clock, following the newspaper report, people had already set out to see the dead men from Mars. Naturally, I was surprised at the news and went straight out to the sand pits, where I found about 20 people from the town surrounding the huge hole in which the cylinder lay. There was very little discussion, as few people in England had much idea about planets in those days. I think the people were disappointed not to find a pile of burned bodies. As I climbed into the pit, I thought I heard a faint sound followed by movement under my feet, but the top of the cylinder had certainly ceased to turn by then. It was only when I got close that the extraordinary nature of this object was obvious to me. At first, its appearance was really no more exciting than a tree blown across the road. It looked like a rusty gas float. But it required a certain amount of scientific education to see that the gray scale on the cylinder was not ordinary rust. The metal shone with an unusual color. By now, I was quite sure that the cylinder had come from the planet Mars, but I thought it was unlikely to contain any living creatures. I thought the turning end might be automatic. In spite of Ogilvy, I still believed that there were men on Mars, and I wondered what the cylinder might contain that would inform us about life on that planet. Although I was impatient to see it opened, I left about 11, as nothing seemed to be happening. In the afternoon, the appearance of the comet had altered very much. The early editions of the evening papers had shocked London with the news report. Message received from Mars, remarkable story from Woking. Ogilvy's message to the Scientific Association had interested every scientist in England, and people were arriving from every direction. It was extremely hot, and although the grass fire had been put out, smoke still rose from the blackened ground. Going to the edge of the pit, I found Henderson, Ogilvy, and a man that I afterward learned was Stent, the royal scientist, standing on the cylinder and giving instructions to several men swinging picks down below. Most of the cylinder had been exposed, although its lower end was still stuck in the sand. As soon as Ogilvy saw me, he called me down and asked if I would mind going over to see Lord Hilton, the owner of the land. The crowd, he said, is getting in the way of the digging, so a fence is needed to keep the people back. He told me that a faint movement was occasionally heard inside the cylinder, but the men could not undo the top. The metal appeared to be extremely thick, so it was possible that the faint sounds we heard were actually very loud inside. I was very pleased to do as he asked, as I was excited to become a spectator. I was told that Lord Hilton would not be home from London until 6 o'clock. When I returned to the common, the crowd around the pit had increased, and I could hear raised voices. Some sort of struggle appeared to be going on near the edge, and as I walked closer, I could hear Stent's voice. "Keep back! Keep back!" A boy came running toward me. "It's screwing out," he said as he passed. "I don't like it." "He's fallen in the pit," cried someone. The crowd moved a little, and as I pushed my way through, I heard an unusual vibrating sound from the pit. "Help keep these silly people back," called Ogilvy. "We don't know what's in the thing." The end of the cylinder was being screwed out from inside, and nearly 2 feet of shining screw could be seen. Suddenly, the lid of the cylinder fell on the sand with a loud ring. For a moment, the circular hole seemed absolutely black. I, and I think everyone else, expected to see a man emerge. Eventually, I saw something gray moving within the shadow. 2 shining disc-like eyes and something like a gray snake wound up out of the writhing center and moved in the air toward me. There was a loud scream from a woman behind me. I kept watching the cylinder, from which other tentacles were now emerging. I saw amazement changing to horror on the faces of the people around me, as there was a general movement backward. I saw the people on the other side of the pit running off, Stent among them. Now alone, I looked again at the cylinder. A wild terror possessed me, as I stood shaking and staring. A large gray shape was rising slowly and awkwardly out of the cylinder. As it swelled up and caught the light, it shone like wet leather. 2 large dark eyes were regarding me steadily from the head of the creature, which was round, and under the eyes, a mouth shook and dropped liquid. The whole shape moved and vibrated as if it was upset, while a loose tentacle held the edge of the cylinder and another waved in the air. Those who have never seen a living Martian could never imagine the strange horror of its appearance. The oddly shaped wet mouth with its pointed upper lip, the lack of facial bones and chin, the waving tentacles, and the heavy breathing from the lungs. Most of all, it was the extraordinary stare from the alive but evil eyes. I was filled with horror at this disgusting creature and ran quickly to hide behind a large bush. Suddenly, the monster disappeared. With a loud thud, it had fallen over the edge of the cylinder and into the pit. I heard it give a loud cry, and immediately another of these dark creatures appeared in the shadow of the opening. After the first sight of the Martians emerging from the cylinder, I was too afraid to go back toward the pit, but I still felt an urgent desire to look into it. As I watched, I saw black tentacles waving below and a circular disc spinning on top of a narrow post rising above the sides of the pit. What was happening? Most of the spectators had gathered in small groups and were as puzzled as I was. "Good God, what ugly creatures!" said a man nearby. "Awful," I said, as we watched side by side. It was late afternoon before anything further happened. There was scarcely a sign of movement from the pit, which, as much as anything, gave the people courage. As the evening approached, there was a movement toward the sand, and I too began to move forward. Then I noticed that some people had walked bravely into the sand pits. Suddenly I heard the sounds of horses and carriage wheels coming from the direction of Horsell. Within 30 yards of the pit, I saw a little black knot of men. The one in front was waving a white flag. Chapter 3. Hot Terror. The white flag was carried by the approaching group. Despite being so ugly, it seemed that the Martians were intelligent creatures. After a hurried discussion, it had been decided that by using signals, we too would show them that we were intelligent. The flag waved to the right and then to the left. Afterward, I learned that Ogilvy, Stent, and Henderson were in this group, making the first attempt at communication. Suddenly, there was a flash of light, and 3 separate puffs of green smoke came out of the pits. This smoke was so bright that the deep blue sky above and the pale areas of the brown common toward Chertsey quickly became dark. At the same time, a faint hissing sound could be heard. Beyond the pit, the group of people holding the white flag stood still and watched this strange display. As the colored smoke rose, the watching faces momentarily turned green. Then slowly, the hissing changed into a soft humming, and then into a long, louder humming noise. Slowly, a swollen shape rose out of the pit, and a faint beam of light seemed to shine from its outline. At once, flashes of actual flame jumped from one to another in the group of gathered people, as if each person were suddenly set on fire. Then, by the light of the deadly flame, I saw them stumbling and falling and others turning to run. I stood staring, not yet realizing that this was death leaping from person to person in that little crowd. There was another flash of light, and a man fell forward and lay still. As the invisible wave of heat passed over them, buildings and trees burst into flame, and even toward Knapp Hill, I saw flashes of fire light up the sky. I saw this invisible flaming death sweeping around, quickly and steadily toward me, but I was too shocked to move. I heard the popping of fire in the sandpits, and all along a curving line beyond, the dark ground smoked and cracked. At last the humming ceased, and the black, swollen object sank slowly out of sight into the pit. All this had happened so quickly that I stood completely dumb and blinded by the flashes of light. To my amazement, The flaming death had passed me by. I was still alive, but I was in a night that was suddenly dark and unknown. Above me, the stars were coming out, and the sky looked faintly green. The common was deserted, and bushes and trees were still smoking toward Woking, where a number of houses were on fire. The Martians and their instruments were entirely invisible, except for that thin post supporting the moving mirror. It was amazing that the peace of the evening hardly seemed to be broken, and nothing else seemed changed, even after the little group of men with the white flag had been wiped out of existence. I realized that I was exposed and alone in the dark common. My fear turned to panic, not only of the Martians, but of the silent night around me. I ran, stumbling through the grass, and did not dare look back in terror that violent death would leap after me from the pit and strike me down. It is still a matter of wonder how the Martians were able to kill men so quickly and so silently. Many think that, in some way, they are able to create an extreme heat that is beamed at any chosen object from a mirror, in the same way as a flashlight throws a ray of light. Exactly how they do it has not been confirmed, but it is certain that a beam of heat is the core of the weapon. Whatever is able to burn flashes into flame. Lead runs like water, iron melts, glass cracks, and water explodes into steam. That night, under the clear stars, nearly 40 people lay dead around the pit, burned and altered beyond recognition, and all along the deserted common, fires burned brightly. The news of the mass killings probably reached all of the towns at about the same time. The shops closed as soon as people heard the news, and excited spectators started to walk toward the common. At this stage, few people knew that the cylinder had opened, although poor Henderson had sent a message to the evening newspaper. When the visitors arrived at the common, they found people talking excitedly and watching the spinning mirror over the sand pits. By 8:30, when the flag carriers were destroyed, the crowd had grown to about 300. 3 policemen were trying to keep the people back and prevent them from approaching the cylinder. Stanton Ogilvy, anticipating the possibility of trouble, had contacted the army base for help to protect these strange creatures from violence. After that, they returned to lead that unlucky advance. The description of their death, as it was seen by the crowd, was similar to my own impressions. The 3 puffs of green smoke, the deep humming noise, and the flashes of flame. That crowd of people had a far narrower escape than mine, but most were saved by a deep pile of sand that blocked the heat ray. They saw the flashes, the people falling, and the bushes catching fire as the heat ray came toward them. But, in the sudden thud, hiss, and glare, the terrified crowd could not move. There were screams and shouts as hats and dresses caught fire. "They're coming!" a woman screamed. And immediately, everyone was turning and pushing at those behind to get to Woking again. Where the road grew narrow, the crowd became stuck, and a desperate struggle occurred. 2 women and a little boy were crushed and left to die in the dark. I remember nothing of my escape, except the panic and stumbling through the trees. Above me was that terrifying beam of heat threatening my life. Finally, I was too exhausted to go any further and collapsed on the side of the road, where I must have remained for some time. Later, I sat up strangely puzzled, and for a moment I could not remember how I got there. A few minutes before, there had been the threat of death, but now I was my normal self again, and no longer afraid. Had the flames and the panic of my escape only been a dream? I struggled over the railway bridge toward the town, where a small group of people talked in front of one of the houses. It was all so normal and familiar. Could all that destruction have been real? It was as if I was watching the world from outside, but did not belong to this peaceful town. Thinking about the flying death just 2 miles away, I stopped and spoke with some people. "What's news from the common?" I asked. "Haven't you just been there?" replied the man. "What's all this nonsense about the common?" said the woman. "Haven't you heard of the men from Mars?" I said. "More than enough," said the woman as she laughed. I felt stupid and angry and tried to explain what I had seen, but they just laughed again at my confused sentences. "You'll hear more about it yet," I said, and went home. I explained to my wife what I had learned. "One thing," I said, to calm the fears I had raised, "they are the slowest things I ever saw crawl. They may shoot people who come near them, but they can't get out of the pit. They might come here, cried my anxious wife. They can scarcely move, I said to comfort her. I explained that Ogilvy had told me it would be impossible for the Martians to live on Earth. Because of gravity, a Martian would weigh 3 times as much on Earth as on Mars. However, there were 2 important points we all missed. Firstly, the Earth's atmosphere has a different chemical structure to Mars's. Secondly, that difference actually helped the visiting Martians reduce the amount of mechanical effort they needed. At the time, I did not consider these facts and felt sure the Martians could not attack us. They have done a silly thing, I said during dinner. They are dangerous because they are overcome with terror, and perhaps they did not expect to find intelligent beings on Earth. Anyway, we can fire a shell into the pit and kill them all at once. The excitement of the events had confused my reasoning. I remember very well saying how stupid Ogilvy had been and how frightened the Martians seemed. I did not know it then, but that was the last normal dinner I would have for very many strange and terrible days. Chapter 4. The Range of the Heat Ray. Of all the events that happened that Friday, the most extraordinary was the sudden crashing halt of all the ordinary habits of our society. Many people, of course, had heard of the cylinder, but it certainly did not cause much excitement. In London that night, poor Henderson's message describing the gradual opening of the cylinder was judged to be a rumor. The evening newspaper, not being able to contact Henderson, as he was dead, decided not to print a special edition. Even within 5 miles of the sandpits, the great majority of people showed no concern and went about their normal activities as though no planet Mars existed in the sky. In Woking Junction, passengers were getting on and off the trains in the usual way. And at the station, a boy was selling papers with the evening news. There were shouts of "Men from Mars!" mixed with the whistles from the engines. Excited people came into the station about 9 o'clock with amazing stories, but caused no more interest than a bunch of drunks might have done. People looking from the carriage windows saw only a red glow and a thin cloud of smoke covering the stars, and thought it was nothing more serious than a burning grass fire. It was only around the edge of the common that any disturbance was obvious, where 6 homes were burning on the Woking border, and the lights were on in all the houses. A curious crowd waited about on the Horsell Bridge. 1 or 2 brave people crawled quite near the Martians, but they never returned, for now and again a beam of light swept the common, and the heat ray followed straight after. Except for the light beam, the common was silent and desolate, and the burned bodies lay about on it all night and all the next day. A banging noise from the pit was heard by many people. In the center of the pit, sticking into the skin of our dear old planet Earth like a poisoned arrow, was this cylinder. Little did we know that the poison was scarcely working yet. Around the silent common, bushes were burning and dark objects were seen lying about in twisted positions. Life went on as usual, as the fever of war that would shortly block blood flow, freeze every nerve, and destroy every brain cell was still to develop in the near future. All night long, the Martians were banging and stirring, hard at work on the machines they were getting ready. Now and then, a puff of green smoke floated up into the night sky. At about 11 at night, 2 groups of soldiers came through Horsell and formed a ring around the edge of the common. An officer, Major Eden, was reported to have disappeared, and his anxious captain questioned the crowd about the missing soldier. A few seconds after midnight, the crowd in Chertsey Road, Woking, saw a green star fall from heaven like a flash of summer lightning and land into the forest toward the north. This was the 2nd cylinder. The next day I went out into the garden before breakfast and stood listening, but there was no sound coming from the common. I called out to a traveler for the latest news. He said, during the night, the Martians had been surrounded by soldiers, and that war was expected, but they weren't to be killed, if it could possibly be avoided. My neighbor said it's a pity they're so unfriendly. It would be interesting to know about another planet. I heard that the forest around Byfleet was on fire and another one of those odd cylinders had fallen. But one's enough, surely. The woods will be hot for days because of the thick growth. After breakfast, I walked down toward the common, and under the railway bridge, I spoke to a group of soldiers who were stopping people from crossing the river. They were very interested in what I told them about the Martians and asked many questions. When I described the heat ray to them, they, despite never having seen the Martians, began to argue among themselves about how they would deal with the strange creatures. "Crawl up under cover and rush them," said one. "Get out," said another. "What would cover us against this heat?" "Burn you alive." "What we have to do is go as near as we can and dig a hole." "Blow your holes. You ought to have been born a forest animal." "Haven't they got any necks then?" asked a third. I repeated my description. "Fish tentacles, that's what I call them. Fighting fish tentacles," he said. "It isn't murder killing creatures like that," said the first speaker. "Why not fire shells straight away and finish them off?" said another. "You never know what they might do." "What shells?" said the first speaker. "There's no time, so do it quickly, that's my advice." I left them arguing, but did not succeed in getting to the common because the army was on guard everywhere and didn't seem to have any information. The residents in the town, however, felt quite secure with the military presence, even though the soldiers had made the people on the edge of the towns lock up their houses and leave. About 4:30, I went to get an evening paper because the morning papers had contained only a very rough description of the killing of Stent, Henderson, Ogilvy, and the others. The Martians seemed busy in their pit, and there was a sound of banging and an almost continuous column of smoke. Apparently, they were getting ready for a fight. "Fresh attempts have been made to signal, but without success," said the papers. The Martians totally ignored the human advance. The sight of the army and all the preparations greatly excited me, as it hardly seemed a fair fight to me at that time. The Martians seemed so helpless in that pit of theirs. About 3:00, I heard the thud of a gun being fired at measured intervals from Chertsey or Addlestone. I learned that the burning forest into which the second cylinder had fallen was being fired at in the hope of destroying the cylinder before it opened. It wasn't until 5, however, that a field gun reached Chobham for use against the first group of Martians. At about 6 in the evening, I heard a dull explosion coming from the common, and then a wave of firing. Close after that came a violent crash that shook the ground quite close to us. From the garden, I saw the tops of the trees near the college burst into smoky red flame, and the tower of the little church collapse and fall. The top of the church had disappeared, and the college itself looked ruined. One of our windows cracked, and a sheet of glass went crashing down into the garden. I stared in surprise, as I suddenly realized that now that the college was blown out of the way, Maybury Hill must be within range of the Martian's heat ray. At that, I grabbed my wife's arm and ran her out into the road. "We can't stay here," I said, and as I spoke, the firing started again on the common. "But where can we go?" screamed my wife in terror. "Leatherhead, your cousins!" I shouted. "How will we get to the Leatherheads?" she cried. "Wait here, you'll be safe." I ran down the hill to the hotel, where I knew there was a horse cart. The owner was in his bar, having no idea of what was going on behind his hotel. I quickly explained that I had to leave my home and urgently needed to borrow the cart. When I arrived home, I called out to a soldier who was going from house to house, warning people to leave. "What's the news?" He turned, shouted something about crawling out in a thing like a dish cover, and ran on to the gate of the next house. A sudden whirl of black smoke hid him for a moment, but very quickly our borrowed cart was clear of the cloud and noise as we raced toward Woking. I saw the doctor's carriage ahead of me. At the bottom of the hill, I turned to look behind me. As far as I could see, thick columns of black smoke, shot with threads of red fire, were puffing up into the still air. The road was crowded with people running toward us. Very faintly, we could hear the rapid fire of a gun eventually stop, and an occasional cracking of rifles. Apparently, the Martians were setting fire to everything within range of their heat ray. When I looked back again, the second hill had hidden the black smoke. I hurried the horse and passed the doctor between Woking and Send. Chapter 5. The Thing. The heavy firing that had broken out while we were driving down Maybury Hill stopped as suddenly as it began, leaving the evening very peaceful and still. My wife was silent and anxious during the journey, and felt that something terrible was about to happen. I reminded her that the Martians were tied to the pit by their extreme weight, and, at the most, could only crawl a little distance. We traveled the 12 miles to Leatherhead without any trouble, and I left my wife in the care of her cousins. Had it not been for my promise to return the cart to the hotel, I would have stayed in Leatherhead that night. How I wish I had! I had been wildly excited all day. I was surprised that I felt such an enthusiasm for war, and was pleased that I had to return to Maybury that night. I even hoped that the last wave of firing we had just heard did not mean the death of the Martians. I really wanted to be there at the end. It was nearly 11 when I left Leatherhead. I was a little depressed because of my wife's fears, but very soon my thoughts returned to the Martians. At that time, I knew nothing about the course of the evening's fighting, or what had started the conflict. As I came through Occam, I saw a strong red glow toward the west and masses of black and red smoke creeping slowly up into the sky. Until I came through Pireford, the red glare was hidden from me. But as I climbed the hill beyond Pireford Church, the glare came into view again, and the trees shook with the approaching storm. I saw the shape of Maybury Hill with its trees and roofs appearing black and sharp against the red sky. A brilliant green glare lit the road around me and showed the distant woods toward Addlestone. I saw that the storm clouds had been split by a thread of green fire suddenly lighting up their wild outlines. Something landed in the field to my left. It was a third falling star. Close behind the strange sight came a purple flash of lightning and an enormous burst of thunder. As the storm broke above me, the horse took fright, and in panic we raced down Maybury Hill. It was impossible to see through the beating rain as I drove blindly down the slope. Suddenly my attention was caught by something that was moving rapidly down the opposite slope of Maybury Hill. At first, I thought it was the wet roof of a house, but a lightning flash showed it to be an object moving with a quick rolling motion. Then, in a particularly bright flash, the strange shape appeared, clear and sharp. How can I describe this thing I saw? An enormous tripod, higher than many houses, was striding over the trees and smashing them in its path. It was a walking engine of shining metal with jointed ropes of hanging steel. The crashing roar of its passage mixed with the noise of the thunder, and in another flash, I saw this great body of machinery tip over with 2 feet in the air, to disappear and appear again with the next flash, 100 yards nearer. Then suddenly, the trees in the woods ahead of me were broken off and driven forward, and a second huge tripod appeared, rushing straight toward me. At the sight of the second monster, my courage went completely. Not stopping to look again, I twisted the horse's head around violently, and the next minute, both the horse and cart fell heavily on the ground, throwing me into a shallow pool of water. I crawled away without any injuries and crouched, wet and shocked, under a thick bush. The wheels of the cart were still spinning, and the poor horse lay dead with a broken neck. A moment later, the giant mechanism went striding past me and up the hill toward Pireford. Seen closer, the thing was amazing, for it was no ordinary machine moving on its way. Machine it was, with a ringing metallic walk and long shining tentacles, swinging and bending about its strange body. On the top was a hood that moved backward and forward like a head, and behind the main body was a huge mass of white metal, shaped like a basket. Puffs of green smoke shot out from the joints of the legs as the monster stepped past me. Another flash of lightning and it was gone. As it passed, it gave a deafening roar that drowned the noise of the thunder, and in another minute it had joined its companion half a mile away. I have no doubt that this thing was the third of the 10 cylinders they had fired at us from Mars. For some minutes, I lay there in the darkness, watching these huge metal creations moving about over the treetops in the distance. The rain was now falling heavily. That, combined with the pool of water I had fallen in, meant that I was wet and cold. It was some time before my shock allowed me to struggle up the bank to dry ground. Not far from me was a little wooden cottage, under cover of the trees and bushes. I made a run for the door, but could not make anyone hear my desperate knocking. I managed to crawl out of sight of the terrifying machines, into the woods near Maybury, and hidden by the trees, I walked on, wet and shaking, toward my own house. If I had fully realized the meaning of all the things I had seen, I would have immediately gone back to my wife at Leatherhead. But that strange night, I was exhausted, scratched, thoroughly wet and shocked by the storm. Trying to get home, I stumbled through the trees, fell into a hole full of rainwater, and finally crawled out into the lane that ran down from the College Arms Hotel. There in the darkness, a man knocked into me and sent me falling backward. He gave a cry of terror and rushed on before I had time to speak with him. The storm was so heavy that it was very difficult to find my way up the hill. However, by creeping close to the fence, I worked my way along the posts to the top. At the top, I stumbled on something soft, and by a flash of lightning, I saw a black coat and a pair of boots. Before I could see the condition of the man, the flash of lightning had passed. I stood over him, waiting for the next flash, and when it came, I saw that his head was bent under his body, and he lay folded up, close to the fence, as though he had been thrown violently against the posts. Overcoming the fear of touching the body, I bent and turned him over to feel for his heart. He was dead. The lightning flashed for a third time on his face, and I saw that it was the owner of the Spotted Dog Hotel, whose cart I had borrowed. I stepped over him carefully and went on up the hill, past the police station, to my own house. Nothing was burning on the hill, although from the common there were still a red glare and puffs of red smoke. By the College Arms pub, a dark shape lay in the road. After I had changed my wet clothes, I went upstairs to the study. The window of the room looks over the trees and the railway toward Horsell Common, but in the hurry of our departure, this window had been left open. It was at the door of the study that I stopped and stared in surprise. The storm had passed, and now the towers of the college and the nearby trees were gone, and I could see the common around the sandpits. Across the light of the red glare, the huge black shapes moved busily about their work. I could not see what the Martians were doing. Several of the houses along the Maybury Road were glowing ruins, and the smell of smoke was strong in the air. A smashed train lay with its back carriages still on the rails. What a strange sight it all was. The black country, broken here and there by glowing and smoking ground. This was the little world in which I had been living safely for years. Now it was this burning confusion. What had happened in the last 7 hours I still did not know, nor did I understand the connection between these mechanical giants and the heavy lumps I had seen emerge from the cylinder. The Martians seemed amazingly busy. Were they intelligent machines, I wondered? Surely that was impossible. I began to compare what I knew of them to a human machine, like a train. How confusing it all was. Chapter 6. Destruction. The storm had left the sky clear, and the smoke from the burning land had covered the little dot that was Mars. It was almost dark when a soldier climbed over my fence and entered the yard. I leaned out of the window, delighted to see another human being, and called out softly to him. "Hello," I said in a whisper. He stopped and looked up in doubt. "Who's there?" he said, also whispering, staring up at me from under the window. "Where are you going?" I asked. "I don't know." "Are you trying to hide?" "Yes." "Come into the house," I said. I could not see his face, but I let him in and locked the door again. "My God," he said as he came through the door. "What's happened?" I asked. "What hasn't happened?" In the dark I could see he made an unhappy gesture. "They wiped us out. Simply wiped us out," he repeated again and again. "Sit down and have some wine," I said, pouring out a full glass. He drank it, then suddenly put his head on his arms and began to cry like a child, while I stood beside him waiting for him to tell me what he had seen. It was a long time before he had recovered enough to answer my questions. In an emotional voice, he told me his story. He was a gunner and had only come into action at about 7, when it was thought that the first party of Martians, under cover of a metal screen, was crawling slowly toward their second cylinder. Later, this screen struggled up on tripod legs and became the first of the fighting machines I had seen. It was the arrival of the gunner and his weapons that had started the action. The soldier had been thrown from his horse at the same moment the gun and all the shells behind him had exploded. He found himself lying under a pile of burned bodies and a dead horse. I lay still, absolutely terrified, he said. We'd been wiped out, and the smell, good God, like burned meat. He had remained hidden, looking out carefully across the common. The rest of the soldiers had tried to rush the pit, only to be swept out of existence. At once, the Martian monster had begun to walk across the sand, with its hood turning around like the head of a human being. A type of arm carried a metal box from which green flashes emerged, and out of an attached pipe smoked the heat ray. In a few minutes, there was not a living thing left, and there were no soldiers to be seen. He heard the Martians banging about for a while and then become still. The thing shut off the heat ray and, turning its back on the gunner, began to stride away toward the burning woods that sheltered the second cylinder. As it did so, another shining giant rose up out of the pit. This second monster followed the first, and at that, the gunner began to crawl very carefully across the hot ash toward Horsell. He crouched behind a broken wall as one of the Martian giants returned. He saw this one chase a man, catch him in one of its steely tentacles, and knock his head against the side of a tree. At last, after dark, the gunner made a run for it and rolled down the slope to the railway line. Since then, he had been creeping along the track toward Maybury, in the hope of getting to London. That was the story I got from him, bit by bit. He was hungry, so I found some meat and bread, which we ate in the dark for a fear of attracting the Martians. As he talked, I began to see his face, blackened and worn, as he no doubt saw mine. It was getting light, and I could see the damage outside the window, where it looked as if an army had rushed across the grass. When we had finished eating, I looked out again through the open window. The fires were almost out, and where the flames had been were columns of smoke. Now in the early dawn, I could also see the burned houses and trees. Never before in the history of war had the destruction been so careless and so general. Now shining with the growing light of day, 3 of the metallic giants stood around the pit, sending puffs of green smoke whirling up into the air, and their hoods spinning as if they were examining the destruction they had made. The gunner agreed with me that we could not stay in the house. He wanted to get back to London and join his company. The strength of the Martians had impressed me so much that my plan was to return at once to Leatherhead and take my wife out of the country. I knew that no part of London or even England would be safe. Between us and Leatherhead, however, lay the third cylinder with its guarding giants. After some discussion, I agreed to accompany the gunner under cover of the woods as far as Chobham, and then go on to Leatherhead. We crept out of the house and ran as quickly as we could down the rough road, stepping over 3 burnt bodies that had been struck dead by the heat ray. Except for an orphanage, which was still on fire, there was not much local damage. The residents must have escaped or gone into hiding, because other than ourselves, no one was out on Maybury Hill. We walked down the lane and entered the woods at the foot of the hill. There was not a breath of wind that morning, and everything was strangely still. The gunner and I talked in whispers, and now and again looked over our shoulders to stop and listen. After a time, we reached the road, and as we did, we saw 3 mounted soldiers riding slowly toward Woking. It was an officer and 2 soldiers carrying an instrument on a stand with mirrors that the gunner said was used to send messages. "You're the first men I've seen coming this way this morning," said the officer. "What's happening?" The gunner jumped down into the road and nodded with respect. "The gun was destroyed last night, sir. We have been hiding. Trying to join company, sir. You'll see the Martians about half a mile along this road." "What on earth are they like?" asked the officer. "Giants in steel, sir. 100 feet high. 3 legs and a body of metal with a great head in a hood, sir." "Come on," said the officer. "I've never heard such nonsense." "You'll see, sir. They carry a kind of box, sir, that shoots fire and strikes you dead." "What do you mean? A gun?" "No, sir." And the gunner began a true account of the heat ray. Partway through, the officer interrupted him and looked up at me. "It's true," I said. "Well," said the officer, "I suppose it's my business to see it too. Look here," he said to the gunner. "Our job now is clearing people out of their houses. You'd better go along yourself and report to General Marvin, and tell him all you know. He's at Weybridge. Know the way?" "I do," I said. "Half a mile, you say?" "At the most," I answered, and pointed over the trees to the south. He thanked me and rode on. We came out of the woods at Byfleet Station, and were far beyond the range of the heat ray. Several farm carts were moving slowly along the road to Addlestone. when suddenly we saw 6 heavy guns lined up and pointing toward Woking. The soldiers stood waiting by the guns, and the spare shells were in carts nearby. "That's good," I said. "At least they'll get one good shot." Further on toward Weybridge, there were men building a long barrier to protect a row of guns already in position. "Useless," said the gunner. "They haven't felt that beam of fire yet." Byfleet was in turmoil. People were rushing about, gathering their possessions together and packing quickly, some dressed in their best clothes. The soldiers, some mounted, were having great difficulty in making the crowd realize how serious their position was. We saw one old fellow arguing with an officer. "Do you know what's over there?" I said, pointing at the trees that hid the Martians. "What?" he asked. "Death," I shouted. Leaving him to think on that, I hurried after the gunner. As we sat and ate the food we had brought with us, the firing began. Groups of soldiers were warning people to move at once, or to hide in their basements. As we crossed the railway bridge, we saw that a growing crowd of people had gathered on the railway station, and later, I heard that there had been violent struggles for seats on the special trains that were run in the emergency. Chapter 7. One Martian Dead. We remained at Weybridge until midday, having reached the junction of the Wey and Thames rivers. At the mouth of the Wey, boats can be hired to cross the water, and it was here that we found an excited and noisy crowd of people trying to escape. People had not yet started to panic, although there were already far too many people for the number of available boats for the crossing. There was a lot of shouting, and several men were even joking. People seemed to have the idea that the Martians were simply dangerous human beings who might attack and rob the town, but would certainly be defeated in the end. Except for where the boats landed, everything was quiet across the Thames. 3 or 4 soldiers stood about, staring at the escaping figures without offering any help. "What's that?" cried a boatmaster. The sound came again, this time from the direction of Chertsey. It was the dull thud of a gun. The fighting was beginning, and almost immediately, companies of soldiers hidden behind the trees started firing one after another. Everyone looked toward Chertsey, but nobody could see anything of the battle. "The soldiers will stop them," said a woman beside me. Then suddenly we saw puffs of smoke far away, up the river, and the ground shook with a heavy explosion, smashing windows in the houses nearby and leaving us shocked. "Here they are," shouted a terrified man. "Over there. Do you see them?" In a straight line, 4 of the armed Martians appeared, striding quickly across the level fields toward Chertsey and the river. The hooded figures seemed to be moving quickly with a rolling motion, and their large metal bodies shone in the sun. Suddenly, a 5th Martian advanced from the side. It carried a huge box high in the air, and the terrible heat ray I had already seen on Friday night struck the town. At sight of these strange, fast, and terrible creatures, the crowd was silent at first. Then the panic and rush started. I remained calm and thought about the deadly heat rays. Water. That was it. "Get under water!" I roared, as I rushed across the sand toward the approaching Martian and dived into the shallow water. Others did the same, and a load of people leapt out of the boats. Then, with the Martian high above me, I threw myself forward and under the water. The noise of the people leaping from the boats sounded like thunder in my ears, but the Martian machine took no more notice of the people escaping than a man would take of an insect. When I raised my head above water, the Martian's hood pointed at the soldiers that were still firing across the river. As it advanced, it swung the box containing the heat ray. In another moment, it was halfway across the river, close to the village of Shepperton, where the 6 guns that had been hidden on the edge of the village immediately fired together. The monster was already raising the box containing the heat ray as the first shell burst 6 yards above the hood. I gave a cry of fear and saw and thought nothing of the other 4 Martian giants. I saw the hood of the 5th Martian swing around in time to be hit by a flying shell, which burst in the face of the thing. The hood flashed and swelled and was blown into torn pieces of red flesh and shining metal. "Hit!" I shouted with a jeer. I heard answering shouts from the people in the water around me. The Martian, without its head, swayed like a giant tree, recovered its balance, and turned and rolled quickly to Shepperton. The living intelligence inside the hood was killed and blown away. The thing was now nothing more than an instrument of metal, moving along without direction. It smashed the tower of Shepperton Church, and then collapsed with a huge crash into the river out of my sight. A violent explosion shook the air, and a column of water, steam, mud, and metal pieces shot far up into the sky. In another moment, a huge and hot wave came sweeping around the bend of the river. I heard people screaming and shouting faintly above the roar of the Martian's collapse. I struggled through the whirling water until I could see around the bend. The fallen Martian was lying across the river with most of its parts underwater. Thick clouds of steam were pouring off the wreckage, and through the cloud I could see the huge legs kicking the water and throwing mud and stones into the air. The tentacles swayed and struck like living arms, and it looked as if the Martian was struggling for its life in the turmoil of the river. Brown liquid was shooting noisily out of the machine. My attention was taken from this death scene by a man standing in the river, shouting loudly and pointing desperately across the water. Looking back, I saw the 4 remaining Martians advancing with huge strides down the bank of the river from the direction of Chertsey, but this time there was no fire from the Shepperton guns. I sank under water that was in a turmoil around me, and becoming hotter every second. For a moment, I raised my head to take a breath, and at first, the whirling cloud hid the Martians completely. The noise was deafening, and I saw 2 huge gray figures bending over the steaming ruins of their fellow Martian, while the 3rd and 4th stood beside it in the water, with the beams from their waving heat rays hissing as they hit the water. The air was full of the metal ringing of the Martians, the crashing of falling houses and trees, and the roaring of fire everywhere. The heat ray went backward and forward over Weybridge, marked by flashes of glowing white, followed by brilliant leaping flames. As the white flashes of the heat ray suddenly came jumping toward me, I stood there for a moment, knowing that I could not escape. Killing the unfortunate people in its path, it swept across the water to Shepperton, and the water in its track rose in a boiling column of steam. A huge, almost boiling wave washed over me as I screamed with pain and struggled through the hissing water toward the shore. I fell on the open sand in full sight of the Martians and expected nothing but death. I have a faint memory of a Martian foot coming down near my head, and then of the 4 carrying away the remaining pieces of the 5th monster. Then, very slowly, I realized that somehow, by a great stroke of luck, I had escaped. After getting this sudden lesson in the power of human weapons, the Martians returned to their original position on Horsell Common. Had they known, they could have reached London with nothing to stop them, other than a few heavy guns. It seemed that they were in no hurry, as every 24 hours, cylinder followed cylinder on its flight between Mars and Earth. The military and naval authorities, now fully aware of the fighting power of the Martians, worked with enormous energy, and every minute, a new gun came into position around the area of Horsell Common. Human spies tried to warn the gunners of the Martian approach. However, the Martians now understood our guns, and not a man dared venture within a mile of any cylinder. The Martians spent the earlier part of the afternoon moving everything from the 2nd and 3rd cylinders to their original pit on Horsell Common. 1 Martian stood on guard, while the rest abandoned their huge fighting machines and went down into the pit. They were hard at work, and tall columns of thick green smoke could be seen throughout the night. While the Martians behind me were preparing for their next attack, I made my plans to escape. I climbed into an abandoned boat and floated away from the destruction. There was no equipment in the boat, so I used my burned hands to push slowly and uncomfortably down the river toward Halliford, with the hot water from the destroyed Martian floating alongside me. Halliford was deserted, and it was strange to see the place so calm and empty at this time of the day. For hours I floated, exhausted from all the violence I had been through. It was not long before I became anxious again and continued my journey. At last I landed on the Middlesex bank near the bridge at Walton and found a hiding place under a bush, desperately wanting a drink of water. Feeling very confused and ill, I found that I was talking to myself. For some reason, I suddenly felt angry with my wife, whom I loved dearly. I cannot understand why I felt this way, except perhaps for my urgent need to reach Leatherhead and remove her from danger. Chapter 8. The Arrival of the Minister. Although I do not remember the arrival of the minister, I became aware of him sitting beside me and staring blankly at the faint flashes that appeared in the sky. I sat up, and he looked at me quickly. "Do you have any water?" I asked urgently. "You've been asking for water for the last hour," he said, as he shook his head. For a moment we were silent, taking stock of each other. I suppose he found me a strange figure, burned and blackened by the smoke, and naked except for my wet trousers and socks. His face looked weak, with his tiny disappearing chin and yellow curls sitting just above his pale blue eyes. He spoke suddenly in a puzzled voice. "What do these things mean?" he asked. I stared at him but did not answer. "Why are these things permitted? What crimes have we done?" I was walking along the road, and suddenly there's fire, explosion, and death, as if it were punishment, and all our prayers for nothing. "Who are these Martians?" "Who are we?" I answered. He held his knees tightly and stared at me. "I was walking to clear my brain," he said. "Suddenly, there's fire, explosion, and death." After a long silence, he began waving his arms. "All the work, all the Sunday schools. What has Weybridge done? Everything gone, everything destroyed. The church, only repaired 3 years ago, swept out of existence. Why?" There was another pause, and he spoke in a wild voice. "The smoke of the burning goes up and up, forever and ever," he shouted. His eyes glowed, and he pointed a finger in the direction of Weybridge. By this time, it was clear that the shock of his loss had almost driven him mad. "Are we far from Sunbury?" I said in a normal voice. "What are we to do?" he asked. "Have these creatures taken over Earth?" "Are we far from Sunbury?" I repeated. "Only this morning I was in church." "Things have changed," I said quietly. "You must keep calm because there is still hope." "Hope!" he cried. "Yes, hope from all this destruction." He listened at first as I began to explain our position, but soon lost interest and stared around him. "This must be the beginning of the end," he said, interrupting me. "The end. The great and terrible day of the Lord, when men will regret their crimes and hide their faces from God." I began to understand the situation and put my hand on his shoulder. "Have courage," I said. "What good is religion if it collapses under trouble? Think of all the wars that have happened before. So why should Weybridge be spared?" For a time he sat in blank silence. "But how can we escape?" he asked suddenly. "They cannot be destroyed. They have no pity." "Maybe," I answered. "The stronger they are, the more calm and careful we must be. Anyway, one of them was killed a short time ago." "Killed?" he said. "How can God's creatures be killed?" I saw it happen. "What's that flash in the sky?" he asked unexpectedly. I told him. "It is a communication device being used by our soldiers." "We are in the middle of everything," I said. "In that direction toward London, our guns are being placed in position, and over there are the Martians, who will be coming this way again very soon." As I spoke, he jumped up and held his finger in the air. "Listen!" he said. From beyond the hills and across the water came the dull thud of distant guns and a strange crying. Then everything was still. "Come on, Minister," I said. "We had better leave now and try to get to London." My younger brother was actually in London when the Martians fell at Woking. The morning paper reported that the Martians, having been alarmed by the crowd, had killed a number of people using a rapid-fire gun, but had not moved from the pit due to their weight. The afternoon papers mentioned that soldiers were all around the common and the woods near Weybridge and Woking. A special report said all lines of communication were interrupted due to falling trees. My brother heard that an accident had prevented trains from reaching Woking that night, but neither he nor anyone else connected the accidents to the Martians. A later report stated about 7 o'clock last night, the Martians came out of the cylinder and under the cover of metallic screens, have completely wrecked Woking Station and killed an entire company of soldiers. No details are known. They have destroyed our field guns and appear to be moving slowly toward Chertsey or Windsor, where barriers are being constructed to stop the advance toward London. No one in London knew much about the Martians, and there was still a fixed idea that these monsters could only move very slowly. There was nothing further to tell people until late in the afternoon, when the papers reported that the people of Walton and Weybridge were pouring along the roads toward London. My brother had no idea about what had happened on the previous night, and it was not until he had bought a paper that he learned that all lines of communication had been interrupted. No one else seemed to be worried or even interested, and at the station, he heard for the first time that the Windsor and Chertsey lines were now blocked, but no information was available. "There's fighting going on around Weybridge," was the extent of the information from the staff at the railway. Only 1 or 2 trains came in from Richmond and Kingston, where an excited passenger spoke to the people on the station. There are crowds of people leaving Weybridge and driving into Kingston in carts because heavy firing has been heard at Chertsey. Soldiers have told them to leave at once because the Martians are coming. What on earth does it all mean? The Martians can't get out of their pit, can they? My brother could not tell him. At about 5 o'clock, the crowd was very excited by the opening of the line between the east and west stations, and by seeing railway trucks full of soldiers and guns that were being taken up to protect Kingston. On the bridge, people were watching a curious brown substance moving down the stream, and a floating body that caught in the weeds. At the side of the river, in Wellington Street, my brother saw the latest news report. Shocking disaster, fighting at Weybridge, Martians driven back, London in danger. The Martians were described as huge machines, like spiders, 100 feet high, as fast as an express train, and able to shoot out a beam of extreme heat. 5 of the Martian machines had been seen, and 1 had been destroyed. Hidden field guns had been placed around Horsell Common, and especially between the Woking district and London. However, all of the field guns had been wiped out, and the soldiers had been killed by heat rays. The Martians had been pushed back and had returned to their 3 cylinders around Woking. Guns were in rapid delivery from Windsor and other towns. Altogether, 100 were in position, mainly to protect London. It was hoped that if any further cylinders fell, they could be destroyed immediately by powerful explosives. The report said that the situation was serious, but the public was asked to avoid panic. There was no doubt that the Martians were odd and terrible, but at the most, there could not be more than 20 of them against our millions. From the size of the cylinders, the authorities guessed that there could not be more than 5 Martians in each cylinder, and at least 1 had been destroyed. The public would be given advance warning, and everything was being done to protect the people in London. Going along the Strand to Trafalgar Square, my brother saw some of the exhausted people who had escaped from West Surrey. He walked down toward Victoria and wondered if he might see me. Some of the travelers were exchanging news with the people on the buses, and one was claiming to have seen the Martians. Metal tanks on legs, I tell you, striding along like men. Beyond Victoria, the hotels were doing a good trade with these arrivals. My brother tried to get information from them, but only 1 man gave him any news of Woking, saying it had been entirely destroyed on the previous night. I was in Byfleet, he said, when the soldiers came and warned us to leave. We went out to look, and there were clouds of smoke to the south from where we heard the guns at Chertsey, and we saw people coming from Weybridge. At about 8 o'clock, the noise of heavy firing was heard all over South London. Down by the river, my brother was able to hear it quite clearly. Chapter 9. The True Nature of the Black Smoke. My brother was now becoming concerned about me and anxious about the whole situation. He thought about all those silent, waiting guns and tried to imagine tanks on legs, 100 feet high. He read the paper, thinking I must be dead. He went to bed a little after midnight and was wakened from strange dreams early on Monday by the sound of shouting, feet running in the street, distant drumming, and the ringing of bells. Wondering if the world had gone mad, he ran to the window to witness his neighbors rushing up and down the street in their nightclothes. "The Martians are coming!" shouted a policeman, banging on each door as he hurried to the next house. The sound of drums and trumpets, coming from the Albany Street Army base, combined loudly with the noise of doors and windows opening and shutting. Along the street came a line of mixed vehicles, hurrying to Chalk Farm Station, where the few special trains were loading. For a long time, my brother stared out of the window in amazement, until he was joined by his neighbor across the hall. "Heavens, is it a fire?" he asked. My brother half answered him and began to dress, running with each piece of clothing to the window, anxious not to miss anything of the increasing excitement. Eventually, a man selling early newspapers came shouting into the street. No air in London. The Kingston and Richmond defenses threatened. terrible murders in the Thames Valley. From every corner of London, people were opening windows and doors to call out and ask questions for which there were no answers. It was the start of the Great Panic, as London, calm on Sunday night, wakened in the early hours of Monday morning to a real sense of danger. My brother went out into the street, where the volume of traffic was increasing rapidly as people rushed by on foot and in every kind of vehicle. "Black smoke!" he heard people crying, as fear spread quickly to panic. A news seller, running away with the rest, threw a paper to my brother as he ran by, and my brother read about the unfortunate death of the army commander. The paper also said that the Martians are able to shoot out enormous clouds of a black and poisonous gas. They have sprayed our soldiers, destroyed Richmond, Kingston, and Wimbledon, and are advancing slowly toward London, wrecking everything on the way. It is impossible to stop them. The only escape from the black smoke is to get as far away as possible. "Black smoke and fire," the voices cried. My brother began to realize what the smoke meant. He raced into the street to get away before the roads were blocked completely by the 6 million people in London, all trying to leave the city at once. It was while the minister had sat and talked so wildly to me, and while my brother was watching the people escaping, that the Martians had attacked again. As far as anyone could tell, the Martians remained in the Horsell pit until 9 that night, busy with some activity that sent out volumes of green smoke. 3 Martians came out about 8 o'clock, advancing slowly and carefully to make their way toward Ripley and Weybridge, where they came in sight of the waiting soldiers. These Martians advanced in a line, each a mile from its nearest fellow, communicating with one another by screaming hoots, changing from one note to another. It was the hooting and the firing of the guns at Ripley that we had heard at Upper Halliford. The Ripley gunners, new to war, fired one shot and ran away. Meanwhile, the Martian, without using its heat ray, walked calmly over the abandoned guns and came unexpectedly on the guns in Painshill Park, which it then destroyed. The shells flashed all around it, and it was seen to advance a few paces, sway, and go down. The fallen Martian set up a continuous howling, and immediately a second shining giant answered and appeared over the trees to the south. It seemed that only one leg of the tripod had been smashed by a shell, so the Martian on the ground and both of its companions beamed their heat rays on the soldiers. The shells blew up, and only 1 or 2 of the men, who were already running over the hill, escaped. For the next half hour, the 3 Martians remained still, but the Martian who had been struck crawled slowly out of its hood, and at that distance appeared as a small brown figure. It was apparently busy repairing its metal cover, for later that night its hood was seen above the trees again. It was a few minutes past 9 that night when these 3 guards were joined by another 4 Martians, each carrying a thick black tube. A similar tube was handed to each of the 3 guards, and the 7 placed themselves at equal distances between Weybridge and the village of Send. The Martians began firing as soon as they started to move forward, and at the same time, 4 of their fighting machines, also armed with tubes, crossed the river. 2 of them came into sight of the minister and me as we hurried along the road that runs out of Halliford. At this sight, the minister cried faintly and began running, but I knew it was no use trying to escape from a Martian, so I called him back and we hid in a bush at the side of the road. The occasional howls of the Martians had ceased, and in absolute silence, they took up their positions in the huge circle around their cylinders. Facing that circle everywhere, the soldiers and the guns were waiting. All the Martians had to do was to advance into the range of fire, and the waiting guns would explode in the loud thunder of battle. How much about us did the Martians understand? Did they know that we were skillful, organized, and working together? Or did they think they could wipe us out completely? I wondered, would the Londoners be able to defend themselves? Would they have the heart and courage for the fight? Then came a sound like the distant thud of a gun, and then another. The Martian beside us raised its black tube up high and fired with a heavy report that made the ground shake. But there was no flash or smoke. Immediately, another Martian answered. I was so excited by these heavy guns that I climbed up to stare toward Sunbury, and as I did so, a second loud report followed. Without any smoke or fire or sound of a crash, a large silent object flew over my head toward Hounslow. "What's happened?" said the minister standing up beside me. Who knows? I said. I looked again at the Martian and saw it was now moving east along the river with a fast rolling motion. Every minute I expected a hidden army to fire on the monster, but there was not a sound. Toward Sunbury was a dark appearance, as though a hill had suddenly grown there, and over Walton we saw another dark shape that became lower and wider as we watched. I looked to the north and saw that a third dark hill had appeared. Everything had suddenly become very still, although far away to the south we heard the Martians hooting to one another. And then the air shook again with the distant thud of their guns. This time there was no reply from our soldiers. At the time we could not understand these things, but later I was to learn the meaning of these threatening shapes. All of the Martians standing in the huge circle had, by means of the black tubes, fired large containers over whatever happened to be in their path. When these containers struck the ground, they smashed, and an enormous volume of heavy black gas spread over the country like a hill. Breathing in the gas meant instant death. The heavy gas fell on the ground in a liquid form and flowed into the valleys and rivers. When it hit water, a chemical action occurred, and the surface was instantly covered with a brown substance that sank and made room for more. It is a strange thing, knowing the instant effect of the gas, that having removed the brown substance, we could drink the water without becoming ill. The gas did not mix as a true gas would do. The substance hung together and flowed slowly down the slope of the land, and eventually combined with the moisture in the atmosphere and sank to the earth in the form of dust. We still have no idea of the real nature of the material. The black smoke hung so closely to the ground that only by being higher up in the air was there a chance of escaping its deadly poison. Chapter 10. Jets of Steam. A man who escaped the attack tells the amazing story of the flowing gas, where the black cloud was allowed to remain until it sank into the ground. Usually the Martians, after they had finished, cleared the air by walking over the affected area and spraying the gas with a jet of steam. They did this with the cloud banks near us, while we watched from the window of a deserted house at Upper Halliford. We could see the strong light searching Richmond Hill, and at about 11, we heard the sound of the huge battle guns that had been positioned there. Our windows shook with every thud, as random shots were fired every 15 minutes at the invisible Martians at Hampton and Ditton. Immediately after every shot, a bright red glow appeared in the night. Then the fourth cylinder fell, a brilliant green meteor, which I learned afterward had fallen in Bushy Park. Before the guns on the Richmond and Kingston Hills began, occasional shots were heard far away to the south, where I believe desperate gunners were trying to fire before they could be poisoned by the black gas. All night the Martians advanced by shooting from their black tubes, and never once, after the Martian at St. George's Hill was struck down, did they give the soldiers any chance against them. Wherever there was a possibility of guns being hidden, a fresh container of black gas was fired. Where the guns were openly seen, the heat ray was beamed on the unlucky people. By midnight, the black smoke covered the whole of the Thames Valley and extended as far as we could see. Through this, two Martians stepped slowly, pointing their hissing jets of steam in every direction. They used very little of the heat ray that night because they did not wish to destroy the country. They only wanted to crush and frighten the human population. And in this, they certainly succeeded. Sunday night was the end of the organized opposition to the Martian attacks. After that, no army would fight them because all effort was useless. Even the sailors on the boats along the Thames refused to stop. The only action men dared to take that night was to quickly prepare traps and explosives. There was no one alive after the attack near Esher. Although the officers had been awake and watchful, the gunners ready, and the shells placed close to the guns. Then came the dull thud of the shots the Martians fired, and everything was destroyed by the smashing containers of black gas. As the black clouds spread around them, people were struggling and groaning in their desperate fight for breath. Night came, and there was nothing left but a silent mass of a thick cloud hiding the dead. The roaring wave of fear swept through London at dawn on Monday. One queue of frightened people gathered around the railway stations. Another was desperately fighting to board the ships on the Thames. Even the exhausted and angry policemen who had been sent to direct the traffic were knocking the heads of the people they were called out to protect. By midday, all social order in the City of London had collapsed. By midday, A Martian had been seen at Barnes, and a cloud of slowly sinking black gas moved along the Thames and across the river fields of Lambeth, cutting off all means of escape over the bridges. After an unsuccessful struggle to get on board a northern train at Chalk Farm, my brother ran out on the Chalk Farm Road and had the luck to be the first into a bicycle shop. He avoided a line of vehicles as he set off on his borrowed bicycle along the Belsize Road. A mile from Edgware, the bicycle wheel broke, so he continued on foot. Soon he was out of the panic and rush and reached Edgware at about 7, hungry and tired, but well ahead of the main crowd. Along the road, people were standing and staring in surprise at the extraordinary column of escaping people. There was no fresh news of the Martians. He remained in Edgware for a while, not knowing what to do next. Perhaps it was an idea of getting to Chelmsford, where some friends of his lived, that at last persuaded my brother to move off toward the east. This was a lucky decision, as he suddenly came upon 2 women, just in time to save their lives. He heard their screams and, hurrying around the corner, saw 2 robbers struggling to drag the women out of their little cart, while a third was holding the head of the frightened horse. One of the ladies, an older woman, was screaming. The other, a younger figure, was striking the man who held her arm. My brother shouted and hurried toward the struggle. One of the men stopped and turned toward him, and my brother, being an experienced fighter, knocked him down against the wheel of the cart. My brother grabbed the shirt of the man who pulled at the younger lady's arm. He heard the sound of the horse's feet and felt a rope sting across his face as a blow hit him between the eyes. He found himself looking at the man who had held the horse's head. The rogue had no time to turn aside, however, before he was thrown to the road by a heavy punch to the face. My brother chased down the lane after the cart when he suddenly stumbled and fell, discovering the robbers close behind him again. He would have had little chance against them had not the younger lady stopped, turned the cart around, and bravely returned to his help. A gun had been hidden in the cart, but she had not been able to reach it earlier. She fired, and the robbers ran off to where the third one lay unconscious in the road. "Take this," said the young lady, and gave my brother her gun. "Go back to the cart," my brother replied, wiping blood from his cut lip. The robbers had obviously had quite enough, for when my brother looked again, they were disappearing quickly along the road without looking back. "May I sit here?" said my brother, and climbed up on the empty front seat. The lady looked over her shoulder. "Yes, I'll drive," she said. So, quite unexpectedly, my brother found himself with a cut mouth, a painful jaw, and bleeding hands driving along a lane with the 2 unknown women. He learned they were the wife and the younger sister of a doctor living at Stanmore who had heard news of the Martian advance. The doctor had hurried home, wakened the women, and told them to drive on to Edgware with the idea of getting a train there. He said he would follow them later, but they had heard nothing more from him and were becoming very worried. They could not stop in Edgware because of the growing traffic, and so had come into this side lane. My brother promised to stay with them until their missing relative arrived, and they made a camp by the side of road. Several travelers came along the lane, and each time my brother gathered as much news as he could. Every reply outlined the danger they were in and increased the urgent need to convince the women to move on as quickly as possible. "I have money for the journey," said my brother. "So do we," said the young woman. She suggested that with the money, they might get a train at New Barnet. My brother thought that was impossible because of the crowds and suggested getting across Essex toward the sea at Harwich and escaping from the country altogether. Mrs. Elphinstone, the older woman, called wildly for her husband George and would not listen to any suggestions. However, the younger woman was reasonable and at last agreed with my brother's idea of going on toward Barnet. The day became extremely hot, and underfoot, the thick white sand was burning. Thus they traveled very slowly. As they approached Barnet, they could hear the sound of voices increasing in volume. They began to meet more people, most of whom were staring ahead, dirty, worn, and exhausted. One man in evening dress passed them on foot, pulling at his hair with one hand and beating the air in a fit of anger with the other, while all the time whispering to himself. My brother noticed pale gray smoke rising from the houses in front of them and covering the narrow lane between the backs of the cottages. Mrs. Elphinstone suddenly cried out as she saw tongues of red flame leaping up above the houses ahead. The noisy voices, they had heard earlier became louder and louder. The lane curved around a sharp bend about 50 yards from the junction of the road. "Good heavens!" exclaimed Mrs. Elphinstone. "Whatever are you driving us into?" Chapter 11. Population on the Move. My brother stopped, for the main road was a packed line of desperate human beings all rushing in one direction. A great bank of dust, white in the light of the sun, made everything within 20 feet of the ground gray and cloudy. The cloud was made worse by the hurrying feet of men and women, lost and crying children, and dogs, horses, and vehicles of every description all pushing and fighting to stay on the road. "Move away!" my brother heard voices crying. "Move away!" The crowd was shouting, and to add to the dust and confusion, a cottage was burning and clouds of black smoke and ash covered the road. On the road leading toward London, for as far as anyone could see, was a vast column of dirty, hustling people, pushing from the narrow lane in their efforts to reach the junction of the wide main road. "Move on!" cried the voices. "Move on!" Edgware had been a scene of confusion, and Chalk Farm had been a wild turmoil, but this was a whole population in panic. It is hard to imagine. The people poured out near the corner and past the group of figures in the lane. Carts and carriages crowded together, leaving no room for those faster and more impatient vehicles that jumped forward when an opportunity showed itself. The people walking at the side of the road were sent flying against the fences and gates of the cottages. "Push on!" was the cry. "Push on! They're coming!" Some of the people in the carts struck stupidly at their horses and fought with other drivers. Some sat still, staring at nothing with dull eyes. Some lay in the bottom of their vehicles, too tired to make any further effort. The exhausted horses were covered with sweat and blood. One even collapsed on the road. "Clear the way!" cried the voices. "Move on!" There were sad, tired women, walking with children that cried and stumbled, their tears mixed with dust from the road. Many of these women were accompanied by men, sometimes helpful, sometimes angry and complaining. Pushing and struggling side by side with them were clerks, farmers, railway workers, and even a number of wounded soldiers. Rogues and thieves, no longer separated from the rest of the community, swore with every step. As different as this crowd was to each other, they all had one thing in common. Fear and pain were on every face. Behind each face was even more fear. Any quarrel or confusion up the road sent them pushing at the person in front of them in panic. The heat and dust had already had an effect on them. Their skins were dry, and their lips black and cracked from their terrible thirst. They were all tired and in pain, with feet swollen from hours of walking and running away. Cries of regret and groans of exhaustion were heard, and through all this noise ran a repeated cry, "Move on! Get out of the way! The Martians are coming!" A few people stopped and moved out of the crowd to rest for a moment. Those too weak to travel any further were pushed out of the way and left behind. A little way down the lane, a girl of 8, alone and crying, threw herself under the bush near my brother. "I can't go on," she whispered. "Ellen!" screamed a woman in the crowd. "Ellen!" The child suddenly leaped away from my brother, crying, "Mother!" "They're coming," said a man riding past on a horse. "Out of the way!" shouted the driver of a high-closed carriage, turning into the lane. The people crushed back on one another to avoid his horse. My brother drove the Elphinstone's horse and cart close to the side, and the carriage stopped at the corner. My brother saw faintly through the dust that 2 men lifted something out on a white sheet and put it gently on the grass beside the road. One of the men came running to my brother. "I need water," he said. "He's dying fast and very thirsty. It's Lord Garrick." "Lord Garrick?" said my brother. "The chief judge?" "Water, please," said the man. "There may be taps in some of the houses," answered my brother, "but we have no water. I dare not leave these ladies." The man pushed hard against the crowd toward the gate of the corner house. "Move on," said the people, pushing back at him. "They're coming, go on." My brother's attention was caught by a man carrying a small bag that split and emptied a pile of gold coins onto the road. They rolled in every direction under the struggling feet of men and horses. The man stopped and looked stupidly at the money. Then he threw himself down and began filling his pockets with coins. A moment later, the foot of a large horse struck him on the head, and he lay still. A scream was heard from under the wheels as a carriage ran over the poor fellow's back. My brother stood up and called to the next driver. A man on a black horse came to his assistance. "Get him off the road," said the helper. By grabbing the man's coat, my brother pulled him sideways, but before he could assist the injured man, the crowd had carried the poor fellow past the entrance to the lane. "Out of the way!" shouted angry voices behind them. He saw Miss Elphinstone covering her eyes, and then he saw a little child staring at a dusty shape that lay black and still, ground and crushed under the rolling wheels. "Let's go back," shouted my brother and began turning the horse around. "We can't cross this hell," he said, and they went back the way they had come. As they passed the bend in the lane, they saw the white face of the dying man. The two women turned away silent and shaking. Around the bend, my brother realized how useless it would be to attempt this route. He turned and spoke directly to Miss Elphinstone. "We must go that way," he pointed, and led the horse around again. For the second time that day, the girl proved her quality. To force their way into the stream of traffic, my brother pushed into the crowd and held back a carriage horse, while Miss Elphinstone drove her cart across in front of its head. In another moment, they were swept forward by the crowd as my brother struggled into the cart and took over the driving. "Point the gun at the man behind us in case he tries anything," he said, giving it to her. "No, point it at his horse." They drove east through Hadley and came across a great crowd of people drinking at the river. Near Barnet, they stopped for the rest of the afternoon, as the violence of the day had exhausted them all. They began to feel hungry and tired, but none of them dared fall asleep. In the evening, people came hurrying along the road going in the direction from which my brother had come. Had the Martians aimed only at destruction, they could have wiped out the entire population of London on that Monday. In this chapter, I have written of my brother's account of the road through Chipping Barnet, so that my readers can realize the extent of the escaping crowd. Never before in the history of the world had such a mass of human beings moved and suffered together. This was no disciplined march. It was a massive and terrible charge, without order and without goal. It was the beginning of the defeat of human progress and death of the whole human race. Beyond the hills at the south of the river, the shiny Martians went about calmly and with method, spreading their poison cloud over the country and then laying it again with their jets of steam. They exploded any shells they came across, cut every line of communication, and wrecked the railroads where they could. They seemed to be in no hurry and did not come beyond the central part of London all that day. Because of the difficulty of traveling on land, the port of London was a remarkable scene. Shipping of all sorts lay there, and boat people were being offered huge sums of money to take travelers on board. Many people who swam out to these boats were pushed under and drowned. At about 1 o'clock, the last of a cloud of black gas appeared between the supports of Blackfriars Bridge. After that, the port became a scene of mad confusion. There were fights and accidents, as a mass of boats crushed together in the northern curve of the Tower Bridge, and sailors had to battle strongly against the people who were climbing down the posts of the bridge from above. When, an hour later, a Martian appeared beyond the clock tower and walked down the river, nothing but wreckage floated in the River Thames. Chapter 12. The Amazing Thunder Child. I will tell you later about the falling of the fifth cylinder, but for now, I will continue with my brother's story. The sixth cylinder fell at Wimbledon, where my brother, keeping watch beside the women in the cart, saw the green flash of it far beyond the hills. The news that the Martians were now in possession of the whole of London was confirmed, as they had been seen at Highgate. My brother did not see them until the next day. He heard that members of the government had gathered at Birmingham, and that enormous quantities of high explosives were being prepared to be used in automatic traps all across the Midland regions. He was also told that the Midland Railway Company had replaced the trains running north from St. Albans to relieve the crowding of the districts outside London, but this information did not change the plans my brother had made, and he and the two women continued on toward the east coast with the aim of boarding a ship for France. That night, the seventh cylinder fell on Primrose Hill. On Wednesday, the three travelers reached Chelmsford. Here, there were rumors of Martians at Epping, and news of destruction of the Waltham Abbey explosive store, following a useless attempt to blow up one of the Martians. People were watching for Martians from the highest church towers in every town. My brother, very luckily for him, as it happened, preferred to move on at once to the coast rather than wait for food, although by then he and the ladies were very hungry. By midday they passed through Tillingham, where they first saw the sea and the most amazing collection of shipping that it is possible to imagine. Because the sailors could no longer come up the Thames to rescue the people, they sailed along the Essex coast to Harwich and Walton, and afterward to Foulness and Shoebury. Several miles out to sea lay a huge warship, sitting very low in the water. This particular warship was called the Thunderchild, and was the only iron ship in sight. Far away to the right, there sat another row of Channel Fleet warships, ready for instant action. At the sight of the sea, Mrs. Elphinstone gave way to panic. She had never been out of England before, and the poor woman seemed to imagine that the French and the Martians might prove to be very similar. It was with the greatest difficulty they managed to get her down to the beach, where eventually my brother attracted the attention of some men on a small steamer coming from the Thames. The men said the boat was going across the English Channel to Ostend in Belgium. It was about 2 o'clock when my brother, having paid their fares, found himself safely on board the steamer with his 2 companions. There were already about 40 people on board, but the captain floated off the coast until the late afternoon, picking up passengers until the ship was dangerously crowded. He would probably have remained longer had it not been for the sound of guns that began in the south. As if in answer, the Thunderchild fired her own small gun and raised a row of flags. A jet of smoke puffed from the ship. Some of the passengers thought that the late afternoon firing came from Shoeburyness, until someone noticed that it was growing louder. At the same time, far away in the south, 3 warships appeared beneath clouds of black smoke. My brother's attention quickly returned to the distant firing in the south, when he thought he saw a column of smoke rising out of the faint gray cloud. The little steamer was already making her way eastward when a Martian appeared small in the far distance, advancing along the coast from the direction of Foulness. At that, the captain on watch swore at the top of his voice with fear and anger at his own delay. Every person on board stood at the rails and stared at that slowly advancing distant shape, higher than the trees or church towers on land. It was the first Martian my brother had seen, and he stood more amazed than terrified, watching the monster walking further and further into the sea. Then, far away beyond the hills, came another Martian striding over the small trees, and then another, still further off, walking through the deep mud toward the water. Then, one by one, they were charging into the sea, as if to stop the escape of all the ships between Foulness and the tower on the beach near Walton. Looking to the north, my brother saw the large circle of shipping desperately preparing for the approaching terror. Ships were moving behind each other, sails being let out, and small craft rushing from one larger boat to another. Suddenly, the steamer turned quickly to avoid being run down and threw my brother onto the ship's boards. He sprang back to his feet and saw a massive iron shape tearing through the water. A spray of salt blinded my brother for a moment. When his eyes were clear again, he saw that the warship, Thunderchild, had roared by and was steaming hard to the rescue of the threatened shipping. Keeping his balance on the rolling ship by grabbing the rails, my brother looked past this charging giant at the Martians again. He saw the 3 of them now close together and standing so far out to sea that their tripod supports were almost entirely under water. Seen at a distance, they now appeared far less threatening than the massive Thunderchild. The Thunderchild drove at full speed toward the surprised Martians, who had no idea of what was approaching them. It was probably the strategy of not firing that allowed her to get as near the enemy as she did, as one shell fired from the warship would have caused a blast from the heat ray in return, to send the Thunderchild to the bottom of the ocean. Suddenly, the nearest Martian lowered its tube and fired a container of black gas at the warship. The container hit her left side and shot away in a black jet of smoke, from which the warship drove clear. To the people on the steamer with the sun in their eyes, it seemed as though the warship was already floating among the Martians. They saw the Martian figures separating and rising out of the water like giant birds as they returned to the beach. One of them raised the heat ray and pointed it down toward the sea. A column of steam rose as the spray hit the water. A burst of flame went up through the rising steam, and the Martian swayed and stumbled. In another minute it was cut down, and a great column of water and steam shot high in the air. The guns of the Thunderchild sprayed the water close by the steamer and smashed a small boat to pieces. At the sight of the Martian's collapse, the captain on watch roared, and all the passengers on the back of the steamer cheered in return. Then there was another roar, for beyond the white waves, something long and black was on fire. The Thunderchild aimed straight for a second Martian and was within 100 yards of it when the heat ray beamed across the water. There was a violent thud and a blinding flash. The Martian fell with the violence of the warship's explosion, and, in another moment, the flaming wreckage of the ship had struck and crushed it like a piece of cardboard. A boiling pool of steam hit everything again. "Two!" roared the captain. The steam covered the water for 30 minutes, hiding the third Martian and the coast altogether. When at last the confusion cleared, the floating bank of black smoke covered any evidence of the Thunderchild, and there was no sign of the third Martian. The little steamer continued on its voyage to sea, and the warships moved slowly back toward the coast, which was still hidden by a thick black cloud of steam and gas. The coast became hard to see as the low banks of clouds were gathering around the sinking sun. The fleet of escaping boats was moving apart when suddenly out of the west came the vibration of guns. Everyone struggled to the rail of the steamer and looked into the hot western sky, but nothing could be distinguished clearly. A mass of smoke rose and covered the face of the setting sun, while the steamer puffed on its way with its passengers in a state of extreme anxiety. The sun sank into the distant gray clouds as the sky darkened. Soon the evening star came into sight. It was deep twilight when the captain cried out and pointed. My brother strained his eyes to see. Something rushed upwards into the clear space above the clouds in the western sky. Something flat, broad, and very large that swept around in a huge curve, grew smaller, and disappeared in the gray mystery of the night. As it flew, it rained down darkness on the land. The Earth Under the Martians. Chapter 1. Surprise number 5. In the first book, I have wandered far from describing my own adventures to tell you of the experiences of my brother. During the previous 2 chapters, the minister and I had been hiding in the empty house at Halliford. I will continue my story from there. After escaping, we stayed in the house all Sunday night and all Monday, cut off from the rest of the world by the black smoke. I was very anxious about my wife as I imagined her at Leatherhead, terrified, in danger, and thinking I was a dead man. I knew her cousin was brave enough for most emergencies, but he was not the sort of man to recognize approaching danger or to act promptly. My only comfort was to believe that the Martians were moving toward London and away from her. The black smoke moved slowly toward the river all through Monday morning, creeping nearer and nearer to us, and eventually floating along the road outside the house where we were hiding. A Martian came across the fields about midday, spraying the poison gas with a jet of boiling steam that hissed against the walls, smashed all the windows it touched, and burned the minister's hand as he ran from the front room. When at last we crept across the wet floors, we were amazed to see that the country was a strange red color mixed with the black of the burned fields. Later that afternoon, when I noticed that we were no longer surrounded and might be able to get away, I wanted to start moving at once, but the minister was slow and unreasonable. "We are safe here," he repeated. "Safe here." I decided to leave him. I wish I had been able to. When it was clear to him that I meant to go alone, he suddenly looked more cheerful and decided to come with me. It was about 5 o'clock when we started along the blackened road to Sunbury. All along the road, and in Sunbury, were the dead bodies of horses and men lying in twisted mounds, covered with thick black dust. We reached Hampton Court without difficulty, went through Bushy Park, and continued on to Twickenham. The woods beyond Petersham were still on fire, but Twickenham was not affected by either heat ray or poison gas. Although no one there could give us any news, the signs of a hurried defeat were obvious along the way, and I clearly remember 3 smashed bicycles in a pile on the road. We crossed Richmond Bridge about 8:30, where I noticed a red substance floating down the stream and wondered what it was. Here again, on the Surrey side, black dust covered a pile of dead bodies near the station, but we had no sight of the Martians until we were nearly to Barnes. Although Richmond was burning quickly, outside the town there was no trace of the black smoke. Suddenly, as we approached Kew, People came running hard toward us, and the top part of a Martian fighting machine appeared above the houses very close by. We were horrified at our danger. Had the Martian looked down, we would certainly have died. We were so shocked that we hid in a nearby garden shelter where the minister sat crying silently to himself and refusing to ever leave our hiding place. I was so determined to reach Leatherhead that in the evening I crept out onto the road toward Kew, leaving the minister crying and complaining in the shelter. That second start was the most stupid thing I ever did, for it was obvious that the Martians were all around us, and no sooner had the minister caught up with me than we saw the fighting machine in the direction of Kew Lodge. 5 little black figures hurried in front of the building, and a minute later we saw the Martian in 3 long strides pick them up one by one and throw them into the metal box attached to its back. It was the first time I realized that the Martians might have some other purpose for us than destruction. We paused for a moment in terror, and then ran through a nearby gate into an empty cottage, where we hid until dark. I suppose it was nearly 11 o'clock before we gathered enough courage to start again, sneaking along behind the trees and watching for the Martians, who seemed to be everywhere. In one place, we fell over a number of dead bodies burned horribly around their heads and chests, but with scarcely a mark on their legs and boots. Sheen had escaped destruction, but the place was deserted, and it was here my companion suddenly complained of thirst. The first house we entered had water and a store of food. We had no idea when we would find any more supplies, so we only ate a very small amount of the bread and meat. The minister, who was still scared and worried, surprised me by wanting to move on. But before we had time to make any decisions for ourselves, something happened to completely change any plans we might have made. There was a blinding glare of bright green light, followed by the loudest noise I have ever heard. Close after this came a thud and the sound of smashing glass, as the ceiling and walls of the house crashed down on our heads. I was thrown against the stove and knocked unconscious. When I recovered, we were in darkness again and the minister was pouring water over me. For some time, I could not remember what had happened. "Are you better?" asked the minister in a whisper. "Yes," I replied. I sat up. "Don't move," he said. "The floor is covered with broken glass, and you'll make a noise. I think the Martians are outside." We both sat so silently that we could scarcely hear each other breathing. Outside and very near, there was a regular metallic knocking. "Listen," said the minister. "Yes," I said. "What is it?" "A Martian," said the minister. I listened again. "It's not like the heat ray," I said. Our situation was so strange that for 3 hours we didn't speak or move. Then we noticed that we could see light, not through the window, but through a space in the wall behind us. Outside, the soil was piled high against the house, but the window had been broken by a heavy mass of liquid garden rubbish that flowed over the table and pooled around our feet. The floor was covered with smashed shelves and their contents, and it became obvious to us then that the main part of the house had collapsed. As the dawn grew brighter, we could see a Martian through the gap in the wall, standing guard over the still glowing cylinder. Suddenly, I knew exactly what had happened. "The 5th cylinder," I whispered. "The 5th shot from Mars has struck this house and buried us under the ruins." For a moment the minister was silent, and then he whispered, "God save our souls." I heard him groaning and talking to himself. Outside, a metallic knocking started, then a violent hooting, and then again, after a quiet interval, a hissing, like the hissing of an engine. These noises seemed to increase in volume as time went on, and eventually a measured thudding and a violent shaking began and continued. Despite the noisy activity, we fell into an exhausted sleep. At last, I woke up feeling hungry and, after eating, crept back into a storeroom, where I must have slept again, for when I looked around, I was alone. I whispered for the minister several times and eventually saw him lying against the hole that looked out on the Martians. I touched the minister's leg, and he jumped so violently that a mass of bricks went sliding down outside and fell with a loud bang. I grabbed his arm, worried that he might cry out, and for a long time we sat without moving. It was then that I noticed the falling material had made the hole larger, and I was able to see out. What an amazing sight! The 5th cylinder must have fallen right into the middle of the house next door, for the building had been smashed to powder and had totally disappeared. The cylinder now sat in a deep hole, already much larger than the pit I had looked into at Woking. The earth all around it had spread out under that enormous blow and lay in huge mounds that hid the nearby houses. Our house had collapsed backward and stood buried under tons of dirt and building wreckage on either side, and it now balanced on the edge of the circular pit the Martians were busy making. The heavy beating sound was just behind us, and over again, a bright green cloud blew across in front of our eyes. Chapter 2. The Brilliant Construction Machine. The cylinder was already opened in the center of the pit, and on the opposite edge, one of the great fighting machines abandoned by its Martian stood stiff and tall against the evening sky. At first, I scarcely noticed the pit and the cylinder because of the extraordinary shining mechanism I saw busy in the hole, and also on account of the strange creatures that were crawling slowly and uncomfortably across the mounds of dirt piled up nearby. The mechanism was one of those complicated construction machines, the study of which has already given such value to human inventions. At first, it looked like a sort of metallic spider with 5 jointed, freely moving arms and an extraordinary number of jointed handles, bars, and waving tentacles about its body. Most of its arms were folded in, but with 3 long tentacles, it was pulling out the plates, handles, and bars that lined the covering and apparently strengthened the walls of the cylinder. As it lifted them out, it placed them on a strip of level dirt near the pit. Its motion was so quick, complicated, and exact that at first I did not think it was a machine, in spite of its shining metal. The fighting machines, although clever and mobile, were nothing compared to this. At first, I supposed the construction machine was merely an odd creature, with a shiny skin, and the controlling Martian was the only thinking part of the whole arrangement. Then, I noticed it had a gray, leathery covering, similar to the other Martian parts nearby. At once, I realized the true nature of this expert mechanism, and with that knowledge, my interest moved to those other creatures, the genuine Martians. The Martians, I now observed, were as different to human beings as it is possible to be. They had huge round heads rather than bodies, each head having a face with a pair of large dark eyes underneath, which stuck out a kind of fleshy beak. The face had no nose, and at no time did they seem to have any sense of smell. In the back of this head was a single tight surface, like a drum, later discovered to be an ear, although it must have been almost useless in our heavy air. Around the mouth were 16 slender tentacles, arranged in 2 bunches of 8. These bunches have since been named by a famous scientist as the hands. As I saw these Martians closely for the first time, they seemed to be trying to raise themselves on these hands, but of course with the increased weight of Earth's atmosphere, this was impossible. I suppose on Mars they may have been able to move about more freely. We discovered later, after a Martian had been cut open, that their internal arrangement was almost equally simple. The largest part of the structure was the brain, sending enormous nerves to the eyes, ear, and waving tentacles. In addition to this were the huge lungs into which the mouth, heart, and its collection of tubes opened. However, the breathing difficulty caused by Earth's thick atmosphere was only too obvious in the shaking movements of the outer skin. Strange as it may be to a human being, the complicated lengths of body parts for processing food did not exist in the Martians. They were merely heads and did not eat as we did. As disgusting as it seems, they took the fresh, warm blood of other creatures and ran it into their own extraordinary systems. It was usually blood obtained from a still-living animal, in most cases from a human being, that run directly into the Martian through a tiny tube. It is difficult to think or talk about what I saw. It was so horrible to watch. However unpleasant their feeding methods were, the Martians saved an enormous amount of time and effort in not having to prepare food. Their absolute preference for human beings as a source of food is partly explained by the nature of the remains of the victims they had brought with them as supplies from Mars. 2 or 3 of these tall, thin creatures seem to have been brought in each cylinder, and all were killed before Earth was reached. In 3 other ways the Martians were different to humans. Firstly, they did not sleep, as they had no body parts or muscles to make them tired. On Earth, moving must have taken a huge effort, yet not one of them stopped working during their stay, and in 24 hours, they did 24 hours of work. Secondly, the Martians were not sexual creatures. It was discovered later after examining a young Martian born during the war on Earth that it developed outside the parent, firmly attached to the head, and swelling in size until it was big enough to drop off the adult. Then, there is the third and most important point in which the systems of these Martians contrast to ours. Bacteria, which cause so much disease and pain on Earth, have either never appeared on Mars or Martian science got rid of them years ago. All the fevers, cancers, and diseases of human life never entered or disturbed the pattern of the Martian lives. Another less important difference between life on Mars and life on Earth is the curious red growth of their plants. Apparently, the plants on Mars, instead of being green, are a bright red. The seeds that the Martians brought with them all produced a brilliant red growth, but the only type that grew strongly and spread quickly was a red climbing weed. By the third day of our confinement, it had already grown over the pit and onto our window. I later found it growing all over the country, especially where there was a good water supply. The Martians had what appears to have been an ear, a single round drum at the back of the head, and eyes with a range of vision not very different from ours. It is commonly thought that they communicated by sounds and movements of the tentacles, but after watching them closely, I have seen 5 or 6 of them performing the most complicated actions together without either sound or movement. I am sure the Martians exchanged thoughts without any physical contact between them. Their strange hooting always happened before feeding, but I don't believe it was a signal. Rather, I think it was the blowing out of air before blood was fed into their bodies. The Martians wore no clothing and apparently did not respond to the changes in pressure and temperature as we did. It was in the other artificial additions to their bodies that their great advantage over us showed. We humans with our machines are just at the beginning of our development and progress that the Martians have already established. They have progressed to becoming mere brains, wearing different bodies according to their needs, just as men wear suits of clothes and take an umbrella in the rain. Quite unlike almost all human inventions, one surprising feature about all the mechanisms that the Martians brought to Earth is the absence of a wheel. Either they did not know of the wheel or had no use for it. They also made no use of the fixed joint, which limited the available variety of any circular motions to only a straight line. Almost all the joints of the machinery show a complicated system of sliding parts, moving over small but beautifully curved rollers. It seems remarkable that the long handles of their machines are moved by a sort of false muscle that responds to a current of electricity. It was this feature that made the Martian rolling movement look like a normal animal motion. This was very disturbing to any of the humans seeing them in action. While I was still observing the slow motions of the Martians and noticing their strange shapes, the minister grabbed my arm and asked if he could look through the hole. The size of the hole only allowed one of us to look through at a time, so I had to give up my viewing and wait impatiently for another turn. When I looked again, the busy construction machine had already put together several of the pieces of equipment it had taken out of the cylinder into a shape very like its own. A busy little digging mechanism was shooting out jets of green cloud and working its way around the pit. This is what had caused the regular beating noise and the constant shocks that had kept our ruined house shaking. The mechanism rang and whistled as it worked, and as far as I could see, the machine was working entirely by itself. Chapter 3. Unholy Death. The arrival of a second fighting machine sent us from our hole in the wall into the storeroom. We were afraid that the Martian might look down at us in the kitchen. Yet despite the terrible danger we were in, we could not resist looking through the hole. At Halliford, I had already come to dislike the minister's complaining voice, his endless comments, and his unreasonable way of thinking. He ate more than I did. I tried to point out to him that as we would have to stay in the house until the Martians had finished with the pit, we would need food to last us all through this time. As the days went on, his selfish ways caused me to constantly warn him, and finally we actually came to blows. That improved things for a short time, but he was a weak man and lacked the courage to face any other person, or even himself. It is unpleasant for me to write these things, but I want you to know the full story. After a long time, I crept back to the hole to find that the Martians now had 3 of the fighting machines, each of which had brought new mechanisms with them. The second construction machine was now completed and was busy supplying one of the newly arrived mechanisms, which stood first in a row alongside the cylinder. This device was shaped like a milk can. above which swung a box, and from which white powder poured into a circular bowl. While one tentacle of the construction machine was busy with the white powder, two hands were digging out and throwing masses of dirt into the box above. Another arm opened a door and removed rusty and blackened lumps of coal from the middle part of the machine. The third tentacle directed the powder from the bowl to a container hidden from me by a pile of blue dust, and out of the container, puffs of green smoke rose into the air. As I watched, the construction machine rolled out a tentacle, and in another second, it had lifted out a bar of shiny white metal and placed it in a growing tower of bars that stood at the side of the pit. The minister was at the hole when the first men were brought to the pit. I was sitting below when he made a sudden movement backward and crouched in a fit of terror. After a little while, my curiosity gave me courage, and I crossed to the hole in the wall. At first, I could see no reason for his terrified behavior. The Martians were no longer visible, being completely hidden by the pile of blue powder. A fighting machine with its legs pulled in stood in the corner of the pit, from which I thought I could hear human voices. I crouched and closely watched this fighting machine. I was sure, now for the first time, that the hood did contain a Martian. I could see the shine of its bright eyes. Suddenly, I heard a cry and saw a long tentacle reaching over the shoulder of the machine to the little cage attached to its back. Then, something struggling violently was lifted high in the air, and as this black object came down again, I saw by the green light that it was a man. I could see his staring eyes and the light on his watch chain. He disappeared behind the pile, and for a moment there was silence. Then began a long and cheerful hooting from the Martians. I struggled to my feet, covered my ears, and raced into the storeroom. The minister looked up as I passed and came running after me. That night, as we hid, we balanced our horror with the terrible desire to watch what was happening. I tried to think of some clever plan of escape. By now, the minister had lost all traces of reason. But even in our desperate position, I did not give up hope. Perhaps the Martians were only making the pit a temporary stop, or did not feel it was necessary to stay on guard. It was on the third day that I saw the boy killed, and I am grateful to say that it was the only occasion on which I actually saw the Martians feed. After that horrible experience, I avoided the hole in the wall for most of the day. I was so terrified by the Martians that I felt there was no way we could escape by ordinary human methods. The Martians had taken away the digging equipment, and except for a fighting machine that stood on the bank of the pit, and a construction machine that was hidden out of my sight, the place was deserted. Then I heard quite clearly a thudding noise like the sound of huge guns. I counted 6 reports, and after a long interval, 6 more, and then silence. It was on the 6th day of our confinement that I watched out the hole for the last time and eventually found myself alone. Where was the minister? I was struck by a sudden thought and crept back to the storeroom to listen, and sure enough, in the darkness I heard him drinking. For a few minutes we struggled, arguing and hitting each other. As the bottle of wine fell on the floor and broke, I would not let him drink or eat any more that day, and I carefully divided the food in the storeroom into quantities to last us for more than a week. All day and all night we sat face to face. I was tired but determined to stop him, and he spent the time crying and complaining of his desperate hunger. After the drinking session, our arguments continued in physical conflict. For 2 long days, we struggled and fought, and there were times when I beat and kicked him hard. The minister was beyond reason and would not stop the attacks on the food or his noisy talking to himself. Slowly I began to realize that my companion was mad, and I think that even my own mind wandered at times. On the 8th day, he began to talk aloud instead of whispering, and nothing I could do would keep him quiet. "It is fair, O God," he said again and again. "It is my punishment. I have not acted in your name. The poor were forgotten. It is just." Then he would suddenly talk about the food, asking, praying, crying, and at last threatening me and shouting that he would bring the Martians on us. For a time I was terrified he might do this. He talked with his voice rising slowly through most of the 8th and 9th days. Threats mixed with calls to be forgiven for his shallow efforts as a minister. He slept for a while, but then began talking so loudly that I was sure he would be heard. "Be quiet," I said. "I have been quiet too long," he said in a voice loud enough to reach the pit. "And now I must be punished. Destruction on this evil city. Suffer to all on this earth." "Shut up," I said, getting up, terrified that the Martians would hear us, For God's pity, no, shouted the minister at the top of his voice, standing up and waving his arms. Speak, for the word of the Lord is upon me. In 3 strides, he was at the door leading into the kitchen. I go. It has already been too long. I put out my hand and felt the huge meat knife hanging on the wall. In a flash, I was after him, wild with anger and fear. Before he was 2 steps across the kitchen, I had caught hold of his shirt. With one last touch of pity, I turned the blade upside down and struck him with the handle. He fell forward and lay stretched across the kitchen floor, white and still. Suddenly, I heard a noise outside, and as I looked up, the hole in the wall was darkened by the lower surface of a construction machine passing slowly across the opening. One of its tentacles curled in the rubbish. Another tentacle appeared, feeling its way over the fallen bricks. In terror, I saw the face and the large dark eyes of a Martian as a long metallic length of tentacle came feeling slowly through the hole. I turned, stumbled over the minister, and stopped at the door of the kitchen. The tentacle was now 2 yards inside the room, twisting and turning with sudden odd movements. For a while, I stood attracted by that slow advance. Then, with a faint cry, I ran from the kitchen shaking violently and scarcely able to stand. I opened the door of the basement and stood there in the darkness, staring up at the faintly lit entrance into the kitchen and listening. Had the Martian seen me? What was it doing now? Chapter 4. Trapped. Something was moving backward and forward, very quietly, and every now and then it tapped against the wall or moved with a faint metallic ringing. I crept to the door and looked into the kitchen as a heavy body was dragged across the floor toward the opening. In the light from the sun, I saw the Martian in its construction machine, examining the minister's head. In panic, I thought it would know of my presence from the mark of the death blow I had given my difficult and noisy companion. I crept back to the basement and hid myself behind the piles of wood and coal, but every now and then, I listened to hear if the Martian had pushed its tentacle through the opening again. The faint metallic ringing started again, and I heard the tentacle feeling over the kitchen and sliding across the basement door. When I heard it scratching at the handle of the door, I held my breath and prayed it couldn't reach me. Suddenly, the door opened. In the darkness, I could just see the tentacle waving toward me, touching and examining the wall, coal, wood, and ceiling. It was like a black snake, swaying its head backward and forward. I was at the point of screaming after it touched the heel of my shoe. For a while the tentacle was still. Then, with a click, it grabbed something and seemed to go out of the basement again. But I was not sure. Apparently, it had taken a piece of coal to examine. Then, I heard the slow sound creeping toward me again, and slowly it came nearer, scratching against the walls and tapping the furniture. While I waited, it knocked against the basement door, closed it, and entered the storeroom, where it shook the tins of biscuits and smashed several bottles of beer. Then there was a heavy bang against the basement door and a long silence of tension and terror. Had it gone? At last I decided that it had. I lay all the 10th day in the dark basement, buried among the piles of coal and wood, not even daring to creep out for a drink of water. It was the 11th day before I ventured out of my hiding place to find the kitchen empty and every bit of food gone. Apparently the Martian had taken it all on the previous day, and at that discovery, I lost hope for the first time. I had no food or drink on the 11th and the 12th day, and my mouth and throat felt so dry that I could think of nothing else but a desperate need for water. In my unhappy state, I sat in the darkness of the kitchen, wondering if I would ever be free of this prison. I thought I had become deaf, for the noises of movement I had become used to hearing had stopped completely. I did not even feel strong enough to crawl to the hole and find out what was happening. On the 12th day, my throat was so painful that, taking the chance of alarming the Martians, I ran the noisy water pump by the sink and got several glasses of blackened and dirty rainwater. I felt much better and was relieved that no curious tentacle followed the noise of the pumping. On the 13th day, I drank some more water, slept for short periods, and constantly thought about eating. Impossible plans of escape floated through my mind. I also thought about the minister and the violent way he had died. The light that came into the kitchen was no longer gray, but red. In my imagination, it seemed the color of blood. On the 14th day, I was surprised to find that the red weed had grown across the hole in the wall, covering the kitchen in a strange red shadow. On the 15th day, the pit was still. For a long while I lay close to the hole, not daring to push aside the red growth that blocked my view. But at last, encouraged by the silence, I looked out. Except at the bottom, where some birds fought over the bones of the dead, there was not a living thing in sight, and all the machinery had gone. I stared in amazement at the empty circular pit in the sand, and at the big pile of blue powder in one corner. There were no Martians or any sign of them, so I carefully forced myself out through the red weed and stood on the pile of rubbish around the pit. The pit was steep, but at one end, the rubbish was high, enough for me to reach the top of the mound and give me a real chance of escape. I hesitated for some time, but as no Martian was visible, I made a desperate climb to the top of the wreckage in which I had been buried so long. For some time I stood breathing in the wonderful fresh air and looking around me. When I had last seen this part of Sheen, it had been a street of comfortable houses, shady trees, and gardens, but now it was a pile of dirt and smashed bricks over which spread a mass of red weed. The nearby houses had all been ruined, but none had been burned, and the red weed grew all through the wreckage. There was no trace of Martians or men, and below me the great pit was empty except for birds fighting over the rubbish. At that moment, I had a feeling of loss, as if the human empire had completely disappeared, leaving the world under Martian control. The feeling passed quickly when I realized how hungry I felt. In the direction away from the pit, I struggled through spots of red weed into a small garden where I filled my pockets with some young onions and carrots and went on as quickly as I could toward Kew. In this hot, dry summer, I was surprised to come across a wide brown sheet of shallow water flowing across the fields. But afterward I discovered that it was caused by the enormous growth of the red weed, which had blocked the river system. At Putney, the bridge was almost lost in a knot of this red growth, and at Richmond too, the water from the Thames covered the field of Hampton and Twickenham. In the end, almost as quickly as it had spread, the growth of the red weed stopped, due apparently to the action of certain bacteria. The rivers carried the last traces of red out to sea. The first thing I did when I saw the water was to satisfy my thirst. I drank a great deal of it and chewed on some of the red weed, but it had an unpleasant metallic taste. I walked through the water, but soon it became too deep to continue. I turned back toward Mortlake, where eventually I found the road going up toward Roehampton and Putney Common. Here the scenery looked familiar, with wreckage everywhere, as if a giant windstorm had swept through, destroying houses at will. After a useless search for food in several of the silent houses, I sat in a sheltered yard for the rest of the day, being too exhausted to walk any further. All this time, I saw no human beings and no signs of the Martians. In the evening, I struggled on along the road toward Putney, where I think the heat ray must have been used for some reason. In a garden beyond Roehampton, I dug out enough young potatoes to satisfy my hunger. From here, I looked down on Putney and the river, and all below me was desolate and still. It filled me with terror to think how quickly that desolating change had come. For a while I felt that all humans had been swept out of existence, and that I was the last man left alive. Near the top of Putney Hill, I came across half a body, with the arms lying several yards from the rest of the parts. The Martians, I thought, had ruined the country, moved on, and were seeking food elsewhere. Perhaps by now they were even destroying Berlin or Paris. I spent that night in the hotel that stands at the top of Putney Hill, sleeping in a proper bed for the first time since my escape to Leatherhead. I found some bread and 2 tins of fruit. Later, from the bar, I filled my pockets with some biscuits that had been forgotten. I stayed in the dark, fearing a Martian might come again searching for food, and at last, as I sat there, I began to think clearly, restored, I suppose, by the food I had eaten. 3 things were in my thoughts: the death of the minister, the location of the Martians, and what had happened to my wife. Chapter 5. Unhappy Predictions. I did not feel guilty about having killed the minister, as his terrifying behavior had driven me to that sudden, angry blow. But if I had known then what was ahead, I would have left him at Halliford. I still faced the problem of the Martians, and not knowing what had happened to my wife. As I sat up in bed, staring into the dark, it was not hard to imagine 100 things about both of them. On this long and terrible night of worry, I even hoped that if it was true that my wife had died, then it would have been best for the heat ray to have quickly ended her life. The morning was bright and fine, but all along the road that runs from Putney Hill to Wimbledon were traces of the panic and flight of the people who had rushed toward London on that Sunday night. I thought of going to Leatherhead, although I knew that unless my cousins and wife had died, they would certainly have gone somewhere else. Feeling lonely, I walked on to Wimbledon Common, where beds of bright flowers lit up the dark common, and there was no red weed to be seen. Suddenly I had a feeling of being watched. I saw a shape crouching under a yellow bush, and as I stepped forward, the shape stood up and became a man armed with a large blade. I approached him slowly, while he stood silent and still, staring at me. His face and clothes were covered with kohl, and there was a deep red cut across his dark chin. At first I did not recognize him. "Stop!" he cried in a rough voice. "Where did you come from?" "From Mortlake," I replied. "I was buried near the pit the Martians made around their cylinder. I've worked my way out and escaped. There's no food here," he said. "Which way are you going?" "I don't know," I said. "I've been buried in the ruins of a house for 13 or 14 days. I don't know what has happened." He looked at me with a curious expression. "I don't want to stay around here," I said. "I want to go to Leatherhead. My wife was." He shot out a pointing finger. "It is you!" he exclaimed. "The man from Woking." I recognized him at the same moment. "You're the soldier who came into my yard." "What good luck," he said. "What a surprise meeting you." He put out his hand and I shook it. I crawled up a drain. The Martians didn't kill everyone. After they went away, I walked across the fields to Walton. But look at you. Your hair has turned gray. He looked over his shoulder suddenly. "This is a bit open. Let's crawl under those bushes and talk." "Have you seen any Martians?" I said. "They've gone to London," he replied. "I guess they've got a bigger camp there. At night you can just see them moving in the glare of their lights, but in the day you can't. I saw a couple across Hammersmith Way carrying something big. And the night before last there was something up in the air. I believe they've built a machine and are learning to fly." I stopped, for we had come to the bushes. "Fly?" "Yes," he said. "Fly." I sat down under a bush. "It's all over for Earth," I said. "If they can fly, no country will be safe." He nodded and said, "But don't you think human life is already beaten? I reckon we're finished." I stared. I hadn't thought of this. I still held a faint hope that life would return to its normal state. He repeated his words. "We're finished. It's all over. They've only lost one Martian. But they've walked over us. The death of that one at Weybridge was an accident. These green stars, I have no doubt they're falling somewhere every night. Nothing can be done. We're beaten." I didn't respond. "This isn't a war," said the gunner. "It never was a war. Any more than there's war between man and insects." Suddenly I remembered the night on watch with Ogilvy. "After the 10th shot, nothing more was fired," I said, "until the first cylinder came." "How do you know?" said the gunner. I explained. He thought. "Something wrong with the gun," he said. "But they'll get it fixed again. And even if there's a delay, how can it alter the end? It's just men and insects. That's what we are now, just insects, only—" "Yes," I said. "We're insects that can be eaten." We stared at each other. "What'll they do with us?" I said. "That's what I've been thinking," he said. "After Weybridge, I saw what was happening. Most of the people were heading to the south, shouting and getting excited, and I said to myself, food won't last this way. So I turned right back. No doubt, lots of people who had money have gone away to France," he said. He saw my expression and stopped suddenly. "The Martians are intelligent creatures, and it seems they want us for food. First, they'll smash up all of our ships, machines, guns, and cities. This destruction will ruin all our order and organization. All that will go. That's the first thing they'll do. Do you agree?" I nodded. "It is. I've thought it out. A Martian only has to appear to get a crowd running in panic. One day, out by Wandsworth, I saw one searching in the wreckage, but they won't keep on doing that. As soon as they're settled, they'll begin catching us, picking the best and storing us in cages and things. That's what will happen. Lord, they haven't begun on us yet. Don't you see that?" "Not begun," I exclaimed. "Not begun. All that's happened so far is through our not having the sense to keep quiet, worrying them with guns and other nonsense. They don't want to bother us yet. They're making all the things they couldn't bring with them, getting ready for the rest of their people. Very likely that's why the cylinders have stopped for a bit, for fear of hitting those Martians already here. Instead of our rushing about, we've got to live according to the new state of affairs. That's how I figure it out. Cities, nations, progress. That's all over. We're beaten. But if that's true, what's there to live for? I asked. The gunner looked at me for a moment. If it's amusement you're after, there won't be any more, because I reckon the game's over. You mean? I mean that men like me are going on living for the good of the human race, because I tell you that I'm dead set on living, and if I'm not mistaken, before long, you'll show what courage you've got too. We aren't going to be wiped out. I don't mean to be caught either, and fed like a prize cow. You don't mean to say. I do. I've thought it out, and I'm going on, right under their feet. Before it's too late, we men have got to learn to live and keep independent. See? That's what has to be done. I stared, amazed and impressed by the man's determination. Great God, I cried, what a man you are! And suddenly I shook his hand. See, he said, I've thought it out. Go on, I said. Well, those who plan to escape must get ready. I'm getting ready, but not all of us are made for the rough life. I wasn't sure about you, since I didn't know that it was really you, or how you might have been buried. The scared sort of people that lived in these houses, and all those little clerks that used to live down that way, they'd be no good. They haven't any spirit in them. Well, the Martians will be a benefit to those scared little people. Nice roomy cages, good food, careful breeding, no worry. After a week or so chasing about for food and shelter, they'll be pleased to be caught, and they'll wonder what people did before there were Martians to take care of them. Plenty will be worried by a sort of feeling that it's all wrong, and feel that they ought to be doing something. But whenever people feel they ought to be doing something, a sort of religion will spring up. These cages will be full of prayers and singing and religious duty. The simple ones will work in a bit of, well, you know, sexual activity. He paused. Very likely these Martians will make pets of some of them. Who knows? Maybe train them to do tricks or even train some of them to hunt us. No, I cried. That's impossible. No human being. What's the good of pretending? Said the gunner. There are men who would do that. What nonsense it is to pretend there aren't. I was too shocked to argue with him. Chapter 6. Talk and no action. I agreed with what the gunner said. In the days before the Martian attack, no one would have questioned who was mentally superior. I, a recognized writer of philosophy, or he, a common soldier. Yet he had calculated a situation I had scarcely recognized. What plans have you made? I asked. He hesitated. Well, it's like this, he said. What can we do? We have to invent a sort of life allowing humans to live and breed, and be sufficiently secure to raise their children. The simple people will go like all simple animals. In 20 years' time, they'll be big, soft, fat, and stupid. The risk is that the ones like us will become wild and slide down into nothing more than big, tough rats. You see, I plan to live underground. I've been thinking about the drains. Under London are miles and miles of drains. A few days of rain will leave them fresh and clean. The main drains are big enough and light enough for anyone. And then there are basements and passages that lead to the drains. You begin to understand now? We must form a band of strong, determined men. No stupid or weak people will be allowed to stay. Those who stay will obey orders. We also want mothers and teachers, all good, sensible women. The useless people have to die. After all, they can't be allowed to weaken the human race. Our district will be London, and we may even be able to run about in the open when the Martians are away. That's how we will save the human race. Do you think it's possible? The important thing is saving and adding to our knowledge. That's where men like you come in. We must make safe places underground and get all the books we can. Not novels and poetry rubbish, but books of ideas and science. We must go to the British Museum and select the books we need. We must watch these Martians. Some of us will go as spies. The most important thing of all is not to upset the Martians, certainly not steal from them. We must show them we mean them no harm. They're intelligent things, and they won't hunt us down if they have all they want and think we're just harmless rats. The gunner paused. Just imagine this. 4 or 5 of their fighting machines suddenly moving off, and not a Martian in them. Not a Martian, but men who have learned to operate these giants. Fancy driving one of those lovely machines? Can't you see them, man? Hurrying, puffing, blowing, and hooting to their other mechanical mates, just as they think they are catching us. Bang, bang! Out comes the heat ray, and we shoot them down with their own flash and flames. For a while I could think of nothing else but the daring and courage of the soldier. Because of the crucial position we were in, I believed in everything he had planned. Later that morning, we hurried to the house on Putney Hill, where he was making a safe place in the basement and digging a passage to reach the drain on Putney Hill. When I saw how little progress he had made, I wondered about the gap between his dreams and his abilities. However, I helped him with his digging and found enjoyment in the steady hard work. As we worked, I began to have doubts about his plan for the survival of the human race. I wondered why we were digging when we could enter the drain from an opening at the other end. Suddenly, the gunner stopped digging and looked at me. "We're working well," he said. "Let's rest for a bit. I think it's time we had a look from the roof of the house." Something puzzled me. I asked him, "Why were you walking about the common instead of being here?" "Getting some fresh air," he said. "But all this work you had to do?" I asked. "Oh, one can't always work," he said, and in a flash, I understood what the nature of the soldier was really like. We went out on the roof together, but there was no sign of any Martians. From our position, we could see the river below, a bubbling mass of red weed and the low parts of Lambeth covered with water. Beyond Kensington, thick smoke was rising. That and a blue cloud hid the hills to the north. The gunner began to tell me of the sort of people who still remained in London. "One night last week," he said, "some fools got the electric light working and lit up half the city. The streets were crowded with people, dancing, drinking, and shouting until dawn. When it became light, they became aware of a fighting machine standing nearby and looking down at them. It picked up nearly 100 too drunk or frightened to run away." "No history book will ever fully describe these awful events," I answered. He grew enthusiastic about his daring plans and talked so confidently about the possibility of capturing a fighting machine that I almost believed in him again. But now that I was beginning to understand something of his character, I could see that he had no intention of taking action. He also had no intention of capturing the great fighting machine himself. Later, we went down to the basement and enjoyed a meal. He was prepared to regard my arrival as a great occasion. "There's some wine in the stores," he said. "Can't we dig better on ordinary beer?" I asked. "No," he said. "I'm the host today. Wine it will be. We have a heavy job ahead of us, so let's rest while we can." Once he had decided this was a celebration, he insisted on playing cards and teaching me several new games. How strange it was. Here we were on the edge of being wiped out forever, and yet we could sit and play with pieces of numbered cardboard. I went upstairs to look at the lights that shone green along the Highgate hills. At first, I stared across the London Valley, where the fires near Kensington glowed red, although all the rest of London was black. Then closer, I saw a strange purple glow waving in the night wind. This puzzled me until I realized it came from the red weed along the river. I began to reason again in a sensible way. I recalled how I had felt since the beginning of the trouble, and up until the silly card playing. I felt ashamed that I had let myself believe all the gunner's wild ideas. I decided to leave him to his drink and his greed and go on to London, where I had the best chance of learning what the Martians and my fellow human beings were doing. After I left the soldier, I went by the High Street and across the bridge to Fulham. There was black dust all along the road from the bridge, and it grew thicker in Fulham. Near Walham Green, the streets became free of powder, and I passed a row of white houses on fire. The noise of the burning was a relief from the awful silence around me. Going on toward Brompton, the streets were quiet again. Once again, there was more black powder in the streets, and about a dozen dead bodies lying in Fulham Road. Where there was no black powder, it was curiously like a Sunday in the city, with the closed shops, the houses locked up, and the stillness. Further along, a woman lay in front of a door with dried blood on her dusty dress. She seemed asleep, but she was dead. The further I walked into London, the quieter it became. It was not so much the quiet of death as that of expectation. At any time the destruction might strike these houses and leave them smoking ruins. It was a city abandoned and falling apart. In South Kensington, the streets were free of dead bodies and black powder. It was near here that I first heard the desolate howling of two notes, rising and falling. "Hoola! Hoola! Hoola!" I turned into Exhibition Road, where I stopped, wondering at the strange, lonely crying. "Hula, hula, hula!" cried the awful waves of sound, increasing in volume. Near Hyde Park Gate, I came on a strange sight, a bus on its side, and nearby the bones of a horse picked clean. I puzzled about this for a while and went onto the bridge over the Serpentine Pond, where the voice grew stronger and stronger. I could see nothing above the houses on the north side of the park, and there was only a cloud of smoke to the west. Chapter 7. Death of the Martians. "Hula, hula, hula!" cried the voice, coming, as it seemed to me, from the district around Regent's Park. My positive mood changed when I heard that desolate cry. Now I was aware that I felt extremely tired, hungry and thirsty, and my feet were sore from the constant walking. It was already noon. Why was I wandering alone in this city of the dead, when all London was black and silent around me? I felt desperate as I thought about old friends and what might have happened to them, and whether I would ever see them again. I came into Oxford Street by the Marble Arch, and here again were several bodies covered with black powder. A horrible smell came from the basements of some of the houses. With difficulty, I managed to break into a hotel and get food and drink. Afterward, I went to sleep on an old lounge behind the bar. I woke in the evening to still hear that unhappy howling. "Hula, hula, hula!" I wandered on through the silent roads via Baker Street to Portman Square and came out eventually at Regent's Park. Over the trees, I saw the hood of a Martian giant and realized that this was the source of the awful crying. I watched it for some time. It appeared to be standing and howling for some unclear reason. I tried to decide what to do. That endless hula, hula, hula made me more curious than afraid. What was the reason for the unhappy crying? I walked along Park Road and got a good view of the howling Martian, who was making that extraordinary hula, hula, hula. I came across the wrecked construction machine on the way to St. John's Wood Station, and at first thought a house had fallen across the road. It was lying among the ruins with its tentacles bent and twisted and its front completely smashed. It seemed as if it had driven straight at the house and been destroyed by the impact. I wondered if it had been out of control, or maybe even without its Martian driver. I walked on toward Primrose Hill, still wondering about all I had seen, until far away through a gap in the trees, I saw a second Martian standing as silent and still as the first. As I crossed the bridge over the Regent's Channel, the sound of hula, hula, hula stopped suddenly, as if it had been cut off. It was nearly dark, and now there was no sound to stop the fear and desolation of the night. Suddenly, I felt a change, the passing of something I couldn't name. Then there was a final stillness and quiet. London was like a ghost town, and the road in front of me became too dark to see where I was walking. The horror of my own fear overcame me, and I ran and hid all night in the shelter of an abandoned taxi in Harrow Road. To my relief, my courage returned before dawn, and I walked on again toward Regent's Park. On the top of Primrose Hill, I saw a third Martian standing tall and still like the others. A crazy desire possessed me. I would die and end it all, and even save the trouble of killing myself. I strode on in full view of the Martian giant, but as I came nearer, I saw that a mass of blackbirds was circling and gathering around the hood. With a rush of relief, I began running along the road. I hurried through the red weed in St. Edmund's Terrace and walked through some deep water toward the Albert Road. Great mounds of earth had been piled along the top of the hill, and there was no doubt that it was the final and largest place the Martians had made. From behind these mounds, thin smoke floated into the sky. The thought that had flashed into my mind grew real. Could it be possible, I wondered? I felt no fear, only a wild joy as I ran toward the silent monster. Yes, hanging out of the hood were pieces of brown matter at which the hungry birds pecked and tore. In a moment, I had struggled through the dirt and climbed to the top of the pile. Below me was an enormous space, with massive machines fallen about in the rubbish, and all around the pit lay a silent row of dead Martians. Dead, killed by the bacteria against which their systems had no resistance. Killed, after all man's efforts and guns had failed, by the most simple creatures that have been put upon Earth. These bacteria have killed members of the human race since life began here. But because of the natural progression of our human family, we have developed resistance to disease. However, there are no bacteria on Mars, and as soon as these attackers ate our food and drank our water, the hidden bacteria began their work toward the Martian death. Remember, man has earned his place on Earth, having built up his resistance to disease. Even the biggest and strongest Martians, lacking this resistance, could not have taken over our world in the end. I have always thought that people live and die for a reason. Nearly 50 dead Martians were lying about, killed by a disease that must have seemed extraordinary to them. It was extraordinary to me at the time. All I felt was relief. These creatures that had been so threatening to the human race were now dead. I stood staring into the pit, feeling great happiness and excitement. The pit was still in darkness. The massive machines, once so powerful and complex, now sat in strange shapes at the bottom. A pack of dogs fought over the bodies that lay in the depth of the pit far below me, and on the opposite side sat the huge, half-finished machine they had been trying to fly. The Martian death had come just in time. I looked up at the vast fighting machines that would never fight again, and at the torn pieces of red flesh that dropped on the top of Primrose Hill. I turned and looked down the hill to where those other 2 Martians stood, exactly as they had died. One had died crying hula 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 to its companions, until the force of its machinery was exhausted. Now these shiny tripod towers of metal lay harmless in the early morning sun. All around the pit, and saved from permanent destruction, stretched the great and beautiful city of London. The towers of the Crystal Palace shone in the sun, and beyond the city were the blue Surrey Hills. I saw for the first time that the roof of St. Paul's Church had a huge hole on its western side. I looked at this wide stretch of houses, factories, and churches, silent and abandoned. As I thought of the hopes and efforts of the many people who had built London and the quick and terrible force that had destroyed it, I realized that this vast dead city of mine might once more be alive and powerful. The turmoil was over. With sadness, I thought that the life I had shared with my dear wife was gone forever. Then, the strangest thing happened to me. I remember standing on the top of Primrose Hill, and then I remembered nothing more of the following 3 days. Later, I learned that there were other people wandering about like me. News of the Martians' defeat spread all over England, and even to Ireland and Scotland. The French, after they heard, sent bread and meat across the sea. Residents started returning to London, and church bells were ringing all over the city. But I have no memory of all these activities and celebrations. A kind family found me on the streets, crying and talking to myself like a madman. They told me that I was singing a crazy song about the last man left alive. These people sheltered me and protected me from harming myself. Apparently, from all my confused speech, they learned a little bit about what I had experienced. When I had recovered, they very gently told me what had happened in Leatherhead. 2 days after I had been trapped in the house, Leatherhead and everyone in it had been destroyed by a Martian who, in a show of power, had quickly and completely crushed the town. I was a sad and lonely man, and I kept talking of returning to the house where my wife and I had been so happy. The kind family did all they could do to persuade me not to go on such an unhappy visit, but I couldn't resist the urge to go back to my old home. I parted from them with tears of thanks and went out into the street. Chapter 8. Recovery and Reunion. Already, London was busy with returning people. In some places, even the shops were open, and fresh drinking water was becoming available. I remember how bright the day seemed as I went back on my unhappy journey to the little house at Woking. People were everywhere, and I wondered how there were still so many of them left. Food from the French government was being distributed from the church. London seemed a city of street people. Their clothes were torn and dirty, hanging loosely over their thin bodies. Even the horses had sharp bones showing through their dull skins. Special policemen stood at the corners of every street. There was no sign of Martian damage until I reached Wellington Street, where I saw the red weed climbing all over the posts of Waterloo Bridge. At the corner of the bridge, I saw a page from the Daily Mail, the first newspaper to start publication again. Most of it was blank, except for a comment about the Martian machines. The examination of the Martian mechanisms had showed amazing results. Among other things, the article stated something I did not believe at the time, that the secret of flying had been discovered. At Waterloo, I boarded a train and managed to get a seat near the window, but all I could see was the blackened landscape and destruction. The train went through Clapham Junction, where everything was still dirty with the powder from the black smoke. Even though there had been 2 days of rain, at Clapham Junction, the railway had been wrecked again, and the trains had to use a temporary rail line. Hundreds of clerks and shop owners were working with the railway workers to get the lines repaired quickly. All down the line, from London, everything looked different. Wimbledon was particularly damaged, and beyond the town, but within sight of the line, were the piles of earth around the sixth cylinder. A number of people were standing at the edge and watching some soldiers down in the pit. An English flag was hanging from a tree and blowing in the morning wind. Red weed grew in every little stream, so it was a relief to look up and see the soft blue of the hills to the east. I got off the train at Byfleet Station and followed the road to Maybury, past the place where the gunner and I had talked to the mounted soldiers, and past the spot where the first Martian had appeared in the storm. I saw the broken cart with the chewed white bones of the horse. I stood for a few minutes, looking at these reminders. I returned through the forest covered with red weed to discover that the owner of the spotted dog had already been buried. As I came home past the College Arms Hotel, a man greeted me by name. I looked at my house with a quick flash of hope that passed immediately. The catch was off the door, and it was opening slowly as I approached. It banged shut again. The curtains of my study were blowing in the open window, from which the gunner and I had first whispered in the dark. The broken bushes were just as I had left them nearly 4 weeks ago. I stumbled into the hall, which felt cold and empty. The carpet on the stairs was untidy and marked by our dirty feet, from when we had climbed up on that wet night. I entered my study, where my papers were lying on the desk exactly as I had left them that morning a month ago. I had been writing an article when I had stopped to get the newspaper from the delivery boy. I remembered how I went down to the gate and how I had listened to his odd story of men from Mars. I came down and went from the hall into the silent dining room, and then an extraordinary thing happened. "It's no use," said a voice. "The house is deserted. No one's been here for the past 10 days. Don't stay here to torture yourself. No one's escaped but you." I was alarmed. Had I spoken my thoughts aloud? I turned to open the French window behind me, walked toward it, and looked out. And there, as amazed and afraid as I was myself, were my cousin and my wife. She gave a faint cry of shock. "I came back," she said. "Somehow I knew." She put her hand to her throat and collapsed into my arms. Now that I am ending my story, I regret that many of the questions about the whole event cannot be answered. One fact, however, seems clear regarding the rapid death of the Martians. When all the bodies of the Martians were examined after the war, they contained no bacteria other than the known varieties found on Earth. Also, they did not bury any of their dead, which suggested they did not have any natural bacteria and did not decay. The nature of the black smoke that the Martians used with such deadly effect and how the heat ray worked both remain a puzzle. Examination of the black powder shows the presence of an unknown element, which probably combined with other chemicals to have the deadly cellular effect on the blood. This was never actually proven. None of the brown matter that floated down the Thames after the destruction of Shepperton was examined at the time, and now, of course, none is available. I have already given a description of the insides of the Martians, recorded after we had cut them open. Everyone is familiar with the remarkable, preserved, and almost complete example of a Martian in the Natural History Museum. A much more serious and general question of interest to everybody is the possibility of another attack from the Martians. I don't think that nearly enough attention or preparation is being given to the subject. We should keep a constant watch on the red planet and record all information. It is only then that we would know when, or if, to expect another attack. With better knowledge, we could use explosives and guns to destroy the cylinder before it cools enough for the Martians to emerge. Or we could fire shots and kill them as soon as the screw of the cylinder opens. One scientist has given an excellent reason for supposing that the Martians have actually succeeded in landing on the planet Venus. 7 months ago now, Venus and Mars were in line with the Sun. Since then, strange shining marks have appeared on both planets, and pictures of these marks show just how similar the marks are to each other. Whether we expect another attack or not, our views of the future of the human race have been greatly changed. We have learned now that Earth is not as secure as we once thought, and that we can never really be sure of when to expect an attack from outer space. Maybe the Martian attack was of benefit to Earth. Maybe it was meant to wake us up a bit. Maybe the Martians have learned from the effect of the bacteria on them that the planet Venus might be a better place to live. For many years to come, Mars will be watched carefully, and falling stars will always cause alarm. It was generally thought, before the cylinder fell, that no other life existed in space. Now we know better. If the Martians can reach Venus, there is no reason to suppose that humans can't do the same. It is a strange and wonderful idea to think of human life spreading throughout space. On the other hand, the destruction of the Martians might only be temporary. What if it is from Mars that all the other planets are controlled? Stress and danger from this difficult time have left me with a sense of doubt and fear. Often I feel I am trapped in the house again, or hurrying with the gunner through the darkness. At night, I see the black powder darkening the streets and the dead bodies lying on the road. I wake from these dreams feeling frightened and cold. Even when I go into the city, I wonder if the people are real or simply ghosts of the past and not really there at all. I go to London and see the busy people in Fleet Street and the Strand, and it comes across my mind that they seem to be like ghosts of the past, haunting the streets as the crowd go through the motions of life in the city of steel. And it is also strange to stand on Primrose Hill, as I did on the day before writing this last chapter, to see the rows of houses and the people walking about in there, and to see the children playing around the Martian machine that still lies on the common. I stand and remember when it was all silent, before that last great day. The most remarkable thing of all is to hold my wife's hand again, after thinking that I had counted her, and that she had counted me, among the dead from the Martian attack. Playlet, The War of the Worlds. The dark common. A man stands hidden behind a bush. He is dirty and is waving a large knife. The narrator approaches him cautiously. The gunner steps forward, stares at the narrator, and points the knife. "Where have you come from?"
"From Mortlake. Could you put the knife down?"
The gunner stares at the narrator. "Well, all right. There's something about you that looks familiar. Wait a minute. You're the man from Woking."
"I recognize you too. You're the gunner that climbed my fence."
The men shake hands. "Where have you been?"
"Buried for 14 days.
"Buried under what?"
"Rubbish. Next to the Martian cylinder."
"How did you get away?"
"I waited until it was quiet. They went away."
"Lucky they didn't smash your head on a tree. What a surprise to see you again. Which way are you going?"
"I don't know. I want to find my wife and cousin."
"Who knows where anybody is?"
"What happened to you?"
"The Martians killed some, missed some. I hid in a drain. I guess we're both pretty lucky." The gunner looks around cautiously. "This is a bit too public. There's a place behind us. Get down low and crawl around here." The two men creep into an abandoned cottage.
"Have you seen any Martians?"
"They've gone to London. You can see them moving at night."
"From here?"
"Yes, by the glare of their lights. They are always running around like black dots. It never stops. You can't see them in the day. I don't know what's going on, but it's something big."
"What do you mean big?"
"Last night I was watching. Suddenly, there's something big up in the air. I reckon they built a machine, some sort of construction for flying. That's what I think."
"Fly? The Martians fly?"
"That's it."
"It's the end for us. It's death to every country on the globe. England and France, Italy, and all those countries to the east. Absolute destruction."
"It's the end of us anyway, don't you think?"
"Why do you say that?"
"Look at the facts. I'm a soldier. I know about war. Look at the losses. One for them and thousands for us."
"Well?"
"Those green stars are falling every night somewhere. It's over for us. We're beaten. Trouble is, they think we're insects, or maybe rats."
"But look at our knowledge and skills."
"Knowledge and skills? What a joke! Trust me, they think we're more like insects." The narrator looks very worried.
"What will they do with us?"
"Eat us, probably." The narrator looks horrified.
"Eat us?"
The gunner looks delighted at the effect of his words on the narrator. "Oh yes, they want us for food.
First, they'll wreck everything we've ever created. No order, nothing working. People will be running around asking what to do. Do you agree?
Well, yes, I do. No organization means no social order.
I've been thinking about it. After the confusion, they'll feed us like prize cows. No doubt about it. They'll start catching us and keeping us in cages.
In cages?
Yes, they'll pick out the best. They'll eat the fat ones first. You'll be all right for a bit. Then it's eat some and train the rest.
Train us for what?
To catch some of the others.
The narrator looks shocked.
People would never do that.
They will. You can't deny it. Anyway, there's worse to come.
The narrator looks amazed.
Worse to come? What do you mean, worse to come? How could it get worse? What are you going to do?
I'm going to live underground.
Underground in what?
In the drains, of course. There are plenty under London, quite big enough.
What if they find you down there?
They're too large to fit in the drains.
You're brilliant. Let me shake your hand.
The men shake hands again. The gunner swaggers and sounds boastful.
I've got it all planned. I'm always thinking it out. That's me.
But what will you do in the drains?
Well, we have to learn to live in a new way. You know, it'll be a new society. We have to start our own. Have to keep the human race going. We'll need education. That's where men like you come in. We'll need books.
Books? What sort of books?
Good books. Science and facts. No romance and other nonsense.
How will you convince other people to live in drains?
That's easy. People will still want, you know, a bit of activity, to have children and that sort of thing. We need people with courage. We need my sort of people. Strong women and men. Do you think it's possible?
The narrator hesitates.
Well, yes.
We'll have to watch these Martians. Some of us will have to go undercover. You know, they're intelligent creatures. If we're careful, maybe they'll just think we're harmless rats.
What about food?
I'm putting some down there now.
Will you come out at all?
The gunner starts speaking loudly and using his hands.
Yes, I've been thinking about one of their fighting machines. You know, to take it.
You don't mean...
Why not? Just imagine. No Martians telling you what to do. No, just a clever man who has learned to operate the thing. Can't you see them running, puffing and hooting and falling over each other's legs? Bang, bang, with a hot beam, a flash of smoke, and they're dead.
I thought you didn't want to upset them. What if you're caught?
Caught? Not likely. I'll creep out when they're not looking.
The narrator is starting to look and sound very doubtful.
I don't think...
You don't think I could?
Well...
Tonight, then.
You don't know how to drive it.
The gunner starts speaking with bravado.
Nothing to it, I reckon. Just turn a few handles.
What if it won't start?
It starts for them. Anyhow, I know guns and engines. It's my job.
Job or not, it's not much of a plan. What if you're not quick enough? You know what they do.
Oh, it'll change. Eventually, they'll get used to us around.
I wouldn't count on that. We don't know where they are half the time.
Anyway, while we're waiting, let's have a glass of wine.
Wine. Won't you need a clear head for the job?
If I don't try tonight, I can always try again tomorrow night.
The two men have a glass of wine.
What about another drop? I found some bottles.
But you won't be steady.
Steady? I've got a cool head. That's how I thought of the drains and all that in the first place.
Do you think they're around? It's very quiet.
They probably crawled back to the pits.
A loud hooting is suddenly heard. The gunner looks terrified.
Oh, not so interested now?
The narrator is beginning to see the true character of the gunner.
Oh, I'm always making plans. It was just an idea I had. Anyway, there's no hurry. Plenty of time.
Did you have a change of mind?
No, I'm just thinking it out.
The narrator sounds exasperated.
For goodness sake, don't stand there in the light.
Don't worry, they can't do us any harm.